Victory for the Axis: How World War II Might Have Been Won, written by Marcus Drayson, narrated by Gloria Feathers. Chapter 1: The Turning Point That Never Was. World War II was a conflict shaped by countless strategic decisions, moments of chance, and pivotal battles. While the Axis powers achieved stunning victories in the early years, several key turning points ultimately led to their downfall. But what if just a few of these moments had played out differently? Could the Axis have secured victory? One of the most significant turning points was the Battle of Britain. After the fall of France in 1940, Germany stood at the doorstep of the United Kingdom, preparing for a possible invasion. The Luftwaffe launched a fierce aerial assault, aiming to cripple British defenses and force a surrender. However, the Royal Air Force, supported by radar technology and an unyielding civilian spirit, held firm. If the Luftwaffe had adjusted its strategy, focusing more on airfields instead of shifting to city bombings, the RAF might have been overwhelmed. A weakened Britain could have been forced to negotiate peace, removing a major Allied power from the war. Another crucial moment came with Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Hitler's decision to open an eastern front spread Axis forces thin and underestimated Soviet resilience. If the invasion had started earlier in the year, avoiding the brutal Russian winter, German forces might have reached Moscow before Soviet reinforcements stabilized the front. Additionally, had Germany prioritized capturing Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus over direct assaults on major cities, the Wehrmacht could have sustained its war machine much longer. A Soviet collapse would have left Germany dominant in Europe, free to shift its focus elsewhere. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 marked another decisive moment. While it successfully crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the failure to destroy American aircraft carriers and critical repair facilities allowed the U.S. to recover quickly. A more coordinated assault, followed by an invasion of Hawaii or Australia, could have severely delayed American retaliation. Without the U.S. fully engaged in the war, the Axis might have solidified their gains before facing a reinvigorated opponent. The North African campaign also played a role in the shifting tide. Had Field Marshal Erwin Rommel received greater reinforcements and supplies, the Axis could have secured control over the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil fields. This would have not only cut off a vital Allied supply route, but also provided Germany with the resources needed to fuel its war effort. The war's outcome was not predetermined. Small changes in strategy, timing, and leadership decisions could have dramatically altered history. The possibility of an Axis victory was real, and if these turning points had unfolded differently, the world today might be unrecognizable. Key battles that determined the war's outcome. World War II was defined by a series of battles that shaped the course of history. While the Axis powers appeared unstoppable in the early years, several critical engagements ultimately determined their fate. If any of these battles had played out differently, the war's outcome might have been drastically altered. The Battle of Britain in 1940 was one of the first major turning points. After the fall of France, Germany sought to force Britain into submission through relentless aerial bombardment. However, the Royal Air Force, bolstered by radar technology and superior tactics, repelled the Luftwaffe. A German victory in the skies could have opened the door for an invasion, potentially knocking Britain out of the war. Instead, Britain remained a base for Allied operations and a symbol of resistance. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942-43 marked the beginning of Germany's decline. Hitler's obsession with capturing the city led to disastrous consequences, as German forces were encircled and destroyed by the Soviet Red Army. The defeat shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and forced Germany onto the defensive. Had the Germans secured Stalingrad and pushed further into Soviet territory, they might have cut off vital resources and weakened the Soviet war effort. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the decisive turning point in the Pacific. The Japanese had dominated the early months of the war, but their attempt to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap backfired. American codebreakers uncovered the Japanese plan, allowing U.S. forces to ambush and sink 4 aircraft carriers. This devastating loss crippled Japan's naval strength and shifted the balance of power in favor of the Allies. A Japanese victory at Midway could have prolonged their dominance in the Pacific, making an American counteroffensive far more difficult. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The successful Allied landings in Normandy established a foothold in Western Europe, allowing for a two-front war against Germany. Despite heavy resistance, the sheer scale of the invasion overwhelmed German defenses. If the landings had failed, the war in Europe could have dragged on much longer, giving Germany time to regroup and develop advanced weaponry. Finally, the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944 was Germany's last major offensive. Hitler aimed to break through Allied lines and force a negotiated peace, but despite initial success, the offensive collapsed due to stubborn Allied resistance and supply shortages. A different outcome might have delayed Germany's defeat, prolonging the war into 1946 or beyond. Each of these battles played a decisive role in shaping the war's outcome. If even one of them had ended differently, the balance of power might have shifted, and history could have taken a vastly different course. Strategic mistakes of the Axis powers. Despite their early successes, the Axis powers made several critical strategic mistakes that ultimately led to their defeat in World War II. While Germany, Japan, and Italy demonstrated military strength and tactical brilliance in many battles, their long-term decision-making was often flawed. Had they avoided these errors, the war could have taken a very different course. One of Germany's greatest mistakes was the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Operation Barbarossa opened a massive eastern front, stretching German resources thin and exposing them to a brutal winter war they were unprepared for. Hitler underestimated Soviet resilience and ignored his generals' warnings about supply lines and logistics. Instead of focusing on a single objective, German forces were divided between capturing Moscow, securing Ukraine, and seizing the Caucasus oil fields. This lack of strategic focus allowed the Soviet Union to regroup and counterattack, eventually turning the tide of the war. Germany also miscalculated in its treatment of occupied territories. Instead of seeking support from populations that resented Soviet rule, such as Ukrainians and Belarusians, the Nazis imposed brutal policies that drove local resistance movements into Soviet hands. A more pragmatic approach could have deprived the Soviets of valuable manpower and resources while providing Germany with local allies. Japan's greatest strategic blunder was its attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. While the assault severely damaged the U.S. Pacific Fleet, it failed to destroy critical American aircraft carriers and repair facilities. More importantly, it drew the United States into the war, transforming what had been a regional conflict into a global one. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to sustain a prolonged war against the U.S., and once American forces fully mobilized, Japan was at a severe disadvantage. A different strategy, focusing on securing resources in Southeast Asia while delaying U.S. involvement, could have prolonged Japan's dominance in the Pacific. Another major Axis mistake was Germany's declaration of war on the United States following Pearl Harbor. Hitler's decision was based on his alliance with Japan, but it was not a necessary move. If Germany had avoided direct conflict with the U.S. and focused solely on defeating the Soviet Union, it might have prolonged its war effort and strengthened its position in Europe before facing American intervention. Italy's failures also contributed to the Axis defeat. Mussolini's invasion of Greece in 1940 was poorly executed and required German intervention, delaying Operation Barbarossa by crucial weeks. Additionally, Italy's struggles in North Africa forced Germany to divert resources to support Rommel's campaign, further weakening the Eastern Front. These strategic mistakes, rooted in overconfidence, poor planning, and underestimation of the enemy, ensured that the Axis powers faced an increasingly difficult war. Had they made different decisions, the outcome of World War II could have been dramatically altered. What could have changed the course? World War II was shaped by a series of pivotal moments where small changes in strategy, timing, or leadership could have dramatically altered the final outcome. While the Allies ultimately secured victory, several key factors could have shifted the war in favor of the Axis powers. One of the most significant changes that could have altered the course of the war was a different approach to Operation Barbarossa. If Germany had invaded the Soviet Union earlier in the spring of 1941, it might have avoided the harsh Russian winter that slowed its advance. Additionally, focusing on capturing Moscow instead of diverting forces to Leningrad and the Caucasus could have crippled Soviet leadership and infrastructure. A Soviet collapse would have freed up German resources and secured vital oil supplies, making it much harder for the Allies to mount a counteroffensive. Another possible shift in the war's outcome could have occurred in the Battle of Britain. If the Luftwaffe had continued targeting Royal Air Force bases instead of shifting to bombing cities, Britain's air defenses might have crumbled. This could have paved the way for Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned invasion of the UK. A defeated Britain would have removed a major base of operations for the Allies, forcing the United States to fight the war without a key European foothold. Japan's strategy in the Pacific was another factor that could have been adjusted. Instead of attacking Pearl Harbor, Japan could have focused on capturing more resource-rich territories while delaying war with the United States. If the U.S. had remained neutral for a longer period, Japan could have solidified its control over the Pacific and built a stronger defensive perimeter. Alternatively, a second strike on Pearl Harbor, targeting American repair facilities and fuel reserves, might have prolonged Japan's dominance in the region, making a U.S. counterattack far more difficult. A different approach to diplomacy could have also shifted the war's outcome. If Germany had not declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. might have focused solely on the Pacific, giving Germany more time to consolidate power in Europe. Additionally, if the Axis had gained stronger allies or maintained better relations with neutral nations like Turkey or Spain, they could have secured additional resources and strategic advantages. Even technological developments could have changed the course of the war. If Germany had prioritized its jet fighter program or developed nuclear weapons before the United States, the balance of power could have been drastically different. Advanced weaponry could have extended the war or forced the Allies into a negotiated peace. While the Axis powers ultimately suffered from strategic mistakes and miscalculations, small changes in key moments could have led to an entirely different world. The war's outcome was not inevitable, and the slightest shifts in decision-making might have led to an Axis victory. Chapter 2: A Different Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was the largest and most brutal theater of World War II, where Germany and the Soviet Union engaged in a war of annihilation. While the conflict ultimately ended in a devastating German defeat, a different strategy could have led to a vastly different outcome. Changes in planning, logistics, and decision-making might have allowed the Axis to secure victory in the East, altering the course of the entire war. One of the most critical factors was the timing of Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 22, 1941, but if Hitler had launched it weeks earlier in the spring, German forces might have reached Moscow before the onset of the brutal Russian winter. Delays caused by Mussolini's failed invasion of Greece forced Germany to divert resources to the Balkans, setting the invasion back. An earlier start could have given the Wehrmacht a crucial advantage, preventing the Soviets from reinforcing their defenses in time. Another key mistake was Hitler's divided strategy. Instead of focusing on a single decisive objective, German forces were split into three separate offensives, targeting Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and the oil-rich Caucasus in the south. This stretched Germany's resources thin and allowed the Soviets to mount effective counterattacks. If Hitler had concentrated his forces on Moscow, he could have crippled the Soviet government and transportation network, potentially forcing Stalin to seek peace. Logistics also played a major role in Germany's failure. The German war machine relied heavily on oil, and securing the Caucasus oil fields should have been a higher priority. If Germany had pushed harder toward Baku instead of engaging in costly urban battles in Stalingrad, it might have gained the resources needed to sustain a prolonged war. Additionally, better planning for winter warfare, such as equipping troops with proper clothing and vehicles suited for cold conditions, could have prevented the catastrophic losses suffered in late 1941 and 1942. Diplomacy was another overlooked factor. The Soviet Union had many ethnic minorities who resented Stalin's rule, including Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Baltic populations. If Germany had positioned itself as a liberator rather than an occupier, it could have gained local support and even recruited millions of anti-Soviet fighters. Instead, brutal occupation policies fueled resistance movements that fought against the Axis rather than aiding them. A more strategic, well-planned campaign in the East could have changed the outcome of the war. A successful conquest of the Soviet Union would have freed up German resources, secured vast territories, and eliminated the greatest threat to Nazi Germany. Without the Soviet counteroffensive, the Axis might have had the time and strength to secure victory in Europe and beyond. Alternative German strategies against the Soviet Union. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, was one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history. While it initially achieved rapid success, strategic miscalculations and logistical failures led to Germany's eventual defeat. However, if Hitler and his generals had pursued different strategies, the war in the East could have unfolded in a dramatically different way. One major alternative strategy would have been focusing on a single decisive objective instead of dividing German forces across multiple fronts. The original plan split the German army into three groups, one advancing toward Leningrad, another toward Moscow, and a third toward the oil-rich Caucasus. This dispersion of forces weakened the overall offensive. A concentrated push toward Moscow, the political and transportation hub of the Soviet Union, might have crippled Soviet leadership and forced Stalin into a desperate position. Capturing Moscow early in the war could have paralyzed Soviet command and coordination, making resistance far less effective. Another approach could have been prioritizing economic and resource objectives rather than symbolic victories. The Caucasus oil fields were essential for both the Soviet and German war machines. If Germany had focused on securing these vital resources earlier in the campaign, it could have gained the fuel necessary to sustain a prolonged war effort. Instead, Hitler's obsession with taking Stalingrad, a strategically questionable target, led to a disastrous battle that drained German manpower and resources. A direct drive toward Baku's oil reserves could have severely weakened the Soviet Union's ability to continue fighting. Germany also failed to account for the logistical challenges of a long-term war in the Soviet Union. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles, and German forces were not equipped for prolonged winter warfare. An alternative strategy would have been to halt major offensives before winter set in, consolidate territorial gains, and prepare for a renewed attack in the spring. This approach would have prevented the devastating losses suffered during the winter of 1941-42, when entire divisions froze or starved due to inadequate planning. Another critical mistake was Germany's treatment of local populations. Millions of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and other Soviet citizens resented Stalin's oppressive rule. If Germany had positioned itself as a liberator rather than an occupier, It could have recruited vast numbers of anti-Soviet fighters and established cooperative governments. Instead, brutal policies, mass executions, and forced labor pushed many potential allies into the arms of the Soviet resistance. A different approach could have weakened Soviet morale and stretched their resources even further. A more focused, resource-driven, and diplomatically strategic campaign could have given Germany a much stronger position on the Eastern Front. Had these alternatives been pursued, the Soviet Union might have collapsed, allowing Germany to dominate Europe and drastically alter the course of World War II. Could Moscow have fallen? The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 brought Hitler's forces within striking distance of Moscow. By October, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Typhoon, the final push to capture the Soviet capital. However, despite initial successes, the German advance stalled due to fierce Soviet resistance, logistical failures, and the onset of winter. But could Moscow have fallen under different circumstances? One of the key factors that prevented Moscow's capture was the delay in launching Operation Barbarossa. Originally planned for May 1941, the invasion was pushed back to late June due to Germany's intervention in the Balkans. This shortened the window for German forces to advance before winter. Had the invasion begun on schedule, German forces might have reached Moscow in late summer or early autumn, avoiding the worst of the mud and cold that later crippled their movement. Strategic decisions also played a critical role. Hitler insisted on diverting forces to Leningrad and Ukraine rather than focusing solely on Moscow. While these objectives had their own strategic value, splitting the German advance weakened the main thrust toward the Soviet capital. A concentrated assault on Moscow, with all available forces pushing forward, could have overwhelmed Soviet defenses before they had time to regroup. Logistics proved to be another major obstacle. The German supply lines stretched across vast distances, and the army was not equipped for prolonged warfare in harsh winter conditions. Unlike the well-prepared Soviet defenders, many German soldiers lacked proper winter clothing, and tanks and trucks struggled in freezing temperatures. If the German High Command had prioritized cold weather gear and secured stronger supply lines, they might have been able to sustain their offensive longer. Soviet resistance was another decisive factor. Stalin refused to flee Moscow, boosting the morale of both the Red Army and civilians. Reinforcements from Siberia, trained for winter combat, arrived just in time to launch a powerful counteroffensive. If Germany had struck Moscow before these reinforcements arrived, the city's defenses might have crumbled, forcing the Soviet leadership to flee or surrender. Even if Moscow had fallen, however, it is uncertain whether the Soviet Union would have collapsed. The country's vast territory meant that Soviet industry and military production had already been relocated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. While capturing Moscow would have been a significant psychological and strategic victory, the Red Army might still have continued fighting from alternative centers of power. Moscow's fall was possible, but not guaranteed. A combination of better timing, concentrated forces, improved logistics, and faster execution might have allowed Germany to seize the city. However, even with such a victory, the Soviet Union's resilience and ability to wage a prolonged war could have meant that Germany's ultimate fate remained unchanged. The impact of securing Soviet resources. One of Germany's biggest challenges during World War II was its lack of natural resources, particularly oil. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had vast reserves of oil, coal, grain, and raw materials essential for sustaining a long-term war effort. If Germany had successfully secured these resources, it could have prolonged its war effort, strengthened its economy, and possibly changed the outcome of the conflict. The most critical Soviet resource was oil. Germany relied heavily on imported oil from Romania and other occupied territories, but this supply was insufficient for a prolonged conflict. The Soviet-controlled Caucasus region, particularly the oil fields of Baku, Grozny, and Maikop, could have provided Germany with an almost limitless fuel supply. If the Germans had prioritized capturing these oil fields early in the invasion, instead of diverting forces to secondary objectives, they could have alleviated the fuel shortages that later crippled their war machine. The success of Operation Blue in 1942, aimed at securing these oil fields, could have given Germany the ability to sustain its mechanized forces and air campaigns for years. Grain and food production were also essential resources that Germany sought to control. The fertile lands of Ukraine, often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe, were capable of providing massive food supplies. If Germany had implemented a strategy of cooperation rather than oppression, it could have gained the support of local populations and secured a steady food supply for its army and occupied territories. Instead, harsh occupation policies, forced labor, and brutal repression turned Ukrainians against the Germans, fueling resistance movements rather than increasing food production. In addition to oil and food, the Soviet Union had an abundance of metals, coal, and industrial materials necessary for producing weapons, tanks, and aircraft. Capturing key industrial centers in the Urals or preventing their relocation further east could have significantly weakened Soviet war production. However, the rapid evacuation of factories beyond the reach of German forces ensured that the Soviet Union continued producing military equipment at an astonishing rate. A more focused campaign targeting industrial hubs might have limited Soviet production capabilities and prolonged Germany's ability to wage war. Securing Soviet resources would not only have benefited Germany militarily, but also economically. A reliable oil supply would have reduced reliance on synthetic fuel production, allowing Germany to allocate more resources to weapons manufacturing. A stable food supply could have supported both soldiers and civilians, preventing shortages that weakened morale. Industrial raw materials would have ensured a steady supply of ammunition, tanks, and aircraft, preventing the production declines Germany faced in the later years of the war. If Germany had successfully taken control of Soviet resources, it could have fundamentally altered the balance of power in World War II. With access to oil, food, and raw materials, the German war machine might have been able to sustain itself far longer, forcing the Allies into a more difficult and prolonged conflict. Chapter 3: Britain Stands Alone, or Falls. After the fall of France in June 1940, Britain found itself standing alone against Nazi Germany. With much of Europe under Hitler's control, the survival of Britain was far from guaranteed. The Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain in an attempt to secure air superiority, while German leaders planned Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of the British Isles. Despite immense pressure, Britain endured, but could it have fallen under different circumstances? Germany's best chance to defeat Britain lay in achieving air superiority. The Battle of Britain, fought from July to October 1940, was crucial in determining whether the German invasion could proceed. The Luftwaffe initially focused on destroying British airfields and radar stations, but Hitler soon shifted tactics, ordering bombing raids on cities instead. This decision allowed the Royal Air Force, RAF, to recover and ultimately repel the German assault. If the Luftwaffe had maintained its attacks on airfields and radar sites, the RAF might have been crippled, leaving Britain defenseless against invasion. A successful invasion, however, required more than air superiority. The German military lacked a strong naval presence in the English Channel, making an amphibious assault extremely risky. The Royal Navy remained a formidable force, and without control of the seas, German landing forces would have been vulnerable to attack. If Germany had prioritized naval expansion earlier in the war or secured stronger cooperation from the Italian Navy, it might have been able to challenge British dominance at sea. Another possible strategy for bringing Britain to its knees was economic strangulation. The German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic sought to cut off vital supplies from reaching Britain, but it never fully succeeded. If Germany had developed a larger fleet of submarines earlier in the war and implemented better coordination in its naval strategy, it could have disrupted Britain's supply lines more effectively. A prolonged blockade might have starved Britain of resources, forcing it to negotiate peace. Diplomacy also played a role in Britain's survival. Winston Churchill's leadership and refusal to consider peace negotiations kept Britain in the fight. However, if a more peace-minded government had come to power, perhaps through political maneuvering or pressure from within, Britain might have sought an armistice. Some British officials, including figures in the aristocracy, favored an agreement with Germany to preserve the empire. A diplomatic solution could have taken Britain out of the war, allowing Germany to focus entirely on the Soviet Union. Britain's resilience was a key turning point in World War II, but its survival was not inevitable. A combination of better German strategy, naval control, economic pressure, or political shifts could have forced Britain to surrender, dramatically changing the course of history. If Britain had fallen, the war in Europe would have taken a vastly different path, leaving the United States and the Soviet Union to face Germany without a crucial ally. A successful Battle of Britain for the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain was one of the most critical moments of World War II. From July to October 1940, the German Luftwaffe attempted to gain air superiority over the Royal Air Force, RAF, in preparation for an invasion of the British Isles. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve this goal marked a significant turning point in the war. However, if the Luftwaffe had been more successful in this battle, the course of history could have been radically different. The key to a successful Battle of Britain for the Germans would have been maintaining a focused strategy on destroying the RAF and its infrastructure. Early in the battle, the Luftwaffe concentrated its efforts on British airfields and radar stations, which were critical to the RAF's ability to defend the skies. However, this strategy was soon abandoned in favor of bombing cities, most notably London. This shift allowed the RAF to recover, regroup, and continue resisting. If the Luftwaffe had stuck to its initial plan, it might have systematically weakened the RAF, making it impossible for them to mount an effective defense. In addition to better strategy, the Luftwaffe could have benefited from improved coordination and a more concentrated force. The Germans were unable to bring all of their aircraft to bear on the RAF in a decisive manner. The Luftwaffe's forces were spread too thin, and their attacks were sometimes disjointed. A more coordinated effort with clearer objectives and more resources focused on specific RAF targets could have overwhelmed the British defenses. The timing of the battle also played a role. The Luftwaffe faced a disadvantage in terms of weather, as the battle unfolded during the summer and fall, when visibility was limited by fog, rain, and clouds. If the Luftwaffe had timed its attacks more strategically, avoiding poor weather conditions, it might have had a greater advantage over the RAF. Clear skies would have allowed German bombers and fighters to carry out more precise, devastating attacks on British airfields and aircraft. Furthermore, a more effective use of German naval power could have supported a successful Battle of Britain. In order to conduct Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, the Germans needed to neutralize the Royal Navy. If the Luftwaffe had worked in tandem with German naval forces, they might have been able to inflict greater damage on the British fleet, securing control of the English Channel and making a seaborne invasion feasible. Had the Luftwaffe succeeded in the Battle of Britain, it could have paved the way for Operation Sea Lion, potentially leading to the invasion and occupation of Britain. The loss of Britain would have been a catastrophic blow to the Allies, providing Germany with a vital base from which to continue its expansion and eventually focus on the Soviet Union. In this alternate reality, the trajectory of World War II would have been dramatically altered, possibly delaying or even preventing the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the UK. Operation Sea Lion was Nazi Germany's plan to invade the United Kingdom in 1940, following the fall of France and the Battle of Britain. The goal was to force Britain to negotiate a peace settlement, or at the very least, eliminate it as a base for Allied operations. However, despite extensive planning and preparations, the operation was never carried out. Had the invasion been successful, the impact on World War II could have been profound. For Operation Sea Lion to have succeeded, Germany needed to establish complete control of the English Channel and achieve air superiority over the RAF. In this respect, the Battle of Britain was a critical precursor. The Luftwaffe had hoped to destroy the RAF and neutralize Britain's ability to defend itself, but the failure to gain air superiority meant that an invasion could not take place. Without dominance of the skies, the German army would have faced enormous challenges in transporting troops and supplies across the Channel. If the Luftwaffe had been more successful in the Battle of Britain, gaining control of British airfields and radar stations, they could have paved the way for a much smoother invasion. With fewer RAF planes in the sky and the ability to bomb British defenses, the Luftwaffe could have provided air support for the German landing forces. The Royal Navy also posed a significant threat to any German invasion force, and the Luftwaffe would have needed to prevent British naval intervention by bombing ports, naval bases, and ships in the Channel. In addition to air superiority, a successful invasion required a robust amphibious landing force. The German army had limited experience in large-scale amphibious operations and lacked sufficient transport vessels to move the required number of soldiers, tanks, and equipment across the English Channel. If the Germans had been able to successfully execute an amphibious assault, capturing key ports such as Dover and Portsmouth would have been essential to establish a foothold in Britain. The success of Operation Sea Lion also depended on Britain's ability to mount an effective defense. The British population had already endured bombings during the Blitz, but an all-out German invasion would have tested the resolve of both civilians and the military. A rapid German advance might have overwhelmed British defenses, especially if the Luftwaffe had succeeded in crippling the RAF. However, the British would have likely fought fiercely to defend their homeland, making any German victory costly. Had Operation Sea Lion succeeded, it would have forced Britain out of the war, providing Nazi Germany with control of Western Europe and a base from which to launch further operations. The consequences of such a victory would have shifted the balance of power in favor of the Axis, delaying or even preventing the United States' involvement in Europe and potentially changing the outcome of the war. Churchill's surrender or exile. Winston Churchill's leadership during World War II was a defining factor in Britain's resistance against Nazi Germany. His defiant speeches, unyielding resolve, and refusal to consider surrender inspired not only the British people but also the Allies. However, had Britain fallen to Germany following a successful Operation Sea Lion, Churchill's fate could have been very different. Would he have surrendered or fled into exile to continue the fight, or would his leadership have been undermined by the overwhelming circumstances? If Germany had successfully invaded and occupied Britain, one of the first priorities for Adolf Hitler would have been to neutralize Churchill. The British Prime Minister had already become a symbol of defiance against the Nazis, and his capture or death would have been a major blow to British morale. However, even if Churchill had been captured, it is unlikely that he would have chosen to surrender or collaborate with the enemy. His steadfast commitment to resisting Nazi rule and his determination to never compromise with Hitler would have likely led him to exile. In the event of a successful German invasion, Churchill might have escaped to the United States or another Allied territory to continue rallying support for the war effort. He had already made connections with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and there was a strong possibility that he could have galvanized American and global resistance against Nazi Germany. Churchill's survival in exile would have allowed him to maintain Britain's leadership role in the global fight against fascism, even if Britain itself had been occupied. Alternatively, if the Germans had captured Britain Without immediately eliminating its leadership, they may have sought to force a peace treaty. Some British officials, including members of the aristocracy and certain political factions, were more inclined toward negotiating with Germany, believing that peace would preserve Britain's empire. Churchill, however, would have likely rejected any peace terms and remained resolute in his belief that surrender was not an option. Even under duress, his determination to continue the fight would have made him an adversary that Germany would have struggled to deal with politically. However, the harsh reality of an occupation might have led to significant pressure on Churchill from within his own government. Faced with the possibility of German domination, there could have been a shift in public opinion and political leadership, with some advocating for peace to spare further destruction. Yet, as a figurehead of resistance, Churchill's influence would have been crucial in ensuring that Britain's commitment to the war continued, either from exile or in a government in exile. If Britain had been forced into surrender or occupation, Churchill's legacy of defiance and leadership would have been remembered, but his role in the war would have shifted. Even in exile, he might have remained the beacon of resistance against Nazi tyranny, continuing to influence global opinion and support the eventual Allied victory. Chapter 4: The Fall of the United States. The United States, with its vast resources and industrial might, played a pivotal role in defeating Nazi Germany and the Axis powers in World War II. However, if events had unfolded differently and the U.S. had been unable to mobilize its war effort or respond effectively to Axis threats, the consequences for the Allies would have been catastrophic. The fall of the United States, though highly unlikely, would have dramatically altered the trajectory of the war and the post-war world order. The most immediate factor in the potential fall of the U.S. would have been a successful and devastating Axis assault. Had Germany and Japan formed a more coordinated strategy or managed to execute a more successful campaign in the Pacific and the Atlantic, the United States might have found itself unable to defend its interests on both fronts. For instance, if Japan had capitalized on its early successes in the Pacific by launching a more direct invasion of the U.S. mainland, particularly along the West Coast, the sheer scale of the attack might have overwhelmed American defenses. Similarly, a more successful German strategy in the Atlantic could have cut off vital supply lines from the U.S. to Britain and the Soviet Union, severely hampering the Allies' ability to resist Nazi domination. The U-boats of the Kriegsmarine were already wreaking havoc on Allied shipping, and a concentrated attack on American convoys could have led to massive economic and military destabilization. If the Germans had been able to secure greater control of the Atlantic, it would have isolated the U.S. and crippled its ability to project power overseas. Domestically, internal division and political instability could have played a role in undermining the U.S. war effort. Although the U.S. was largely united in its response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, prolonged conflict and mounting casualties could have led to war weariness. Political factions within the country, including isolationists and those advocating for peace with the Axis, might have grown stronger, weakening public support for continuing the fight. If the U.S. government had faltered or a peace-oriented administration had taken power, it is possible that the country might have sought a negotiated settlement, which could have led to a separate peace with the Axis powers. The collapse of American resolve would have created a vacuum in the Allied efforts. The absence of the U.S. would have severely limited support for Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, all of whom were heavily reliant on American industrial output and military aid. Without the full industrial power of the U.S., the Axis would have been able to consolidate its gains, and the road to victory for the Allies would have become a far more difficult, if not impossible, journey. Had the U.S. fallen, the Axis powers could have achieved unchallenged dominance in Europe and Asia, reshaping the world in their image. The defeat of the United States would have fundamentally altered the outcome of World War II, potentially leading to a protracted stalemate or a world where Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan maintained control over vast portions of the globe. Japan's alternative war strategies. Japan's path to aggression in World War II was shaped by its desire for territorial expansion and resources, particularly in East Asia and the Pacific. Its early successes in the war, such as the attack on Pearl Harbor and the rapid conquest of Southeast Asia, demonstrated Japan's military prowess. However, despite initial victories, Japan's strategies faltered as the United States and its allies mounted a successful counteroffensive. Had Japan pursued alternative strategies, the outcome of the war in the Pacific could have been drastically different. One potential alternative strategy for Japan would have been to focus more heavily on consolidating and fortifying the territories it had already seized, rather than attempting to expand further. The rapid advance through China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands stretched Japan's military resources thin, leaving it vulnerable to supply shortages and attacks from the Allies. By fortifying its position and focusing on defense, Japan could have worked to strengthen its hold over its territorial empire, making it more difficult for Allied forces to reclaim the land. This defensive strategy might have allowed Japan to maintain its empire for a longer period, buying time to negotiate a favorable peace settlement with the Allies. Another alternative strategy could have been for Japan to shift its focus away from the Pacific theater and direct its efforts towards the Soviet Union. Japan had already signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in 1941, but the two countries had competing interests in the region. Had Japan directed its military forces toward the Soviet Union, particularly in the Manchuria region, it could have put significant pressure on the Soviets, potentially preventing them from opening a second front against Germany. This strategy might have delayed or even altered the course of the war in Europe, as the Soviets could have been forced to divide their resources between the Pacific and the Eastern Front. Japan could also have benefited from more diplomatic efforts in Asia. Rather than antagonizing China through brutal occupation and warfare, Japan could have sought to secure more favorable relations with China and other Asian nations. By fostering alliances or neutralizing potential threats in Asia, Japan might have avoided the protracted conflict with China and built a more stable foundation for its imperial ambitions. Lastly, Japan's strategy in the Pacific could have shifted from direct confrontation to more indirect means of warfare. Instead of focusing on major battles and costly amphibious landings, Japan could have increased its use of guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and naval blockades to weaken the U.S. over time. By adopting a more strategic, less conventional approach, Japan might have been able to prolong the war, forcing the U.S. to expend greater resources on the conflict. Had Japan chosen different strategies, it may have been able to avoid some of the key mistakes that led to its defeat, potentially altering the course of the Pacific War and the broader conflict. The impact of a crippled U.S. Navy. The United States Navy was a key element of Allied power during World War II, and its ability to control the seas was crucial to the eventual victory over the Axis powers. If the U.S. Navy had been significantly crippled early in the war, the impact on the course of the conflict would have been immense. A weakened U.S. Navy would have limited America's ability to support its allies, defend its territories, and challenge Axis forces across the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. One of the most significant impacts of a crippled U.S. Navy would have been the disruption of supply lines. The United States, even before officially entering the war, provided vast quantities of supplies, weapons, and resources to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations. The U.S. Navy was essential for ensuring that these supplies reached their destinations across the Atlantic and Pacific. A weakened or incapacitated Navy would have left these vital supply routes vulnerable to attacks from German U-boats, Italian submarines, and Japanese naval forces. The Axis powers could have choked off these critical supply lines, significantly hampering the war effort of the Allies and potentially pushing Britain and the Soviet Union to the brink of collapse. The defeat of the U.S. Navy would also have had dire consequences for the Pacific theater. The U.S. Navy was crucial in the Pacific War, both in defending the American homeland from Japanese attack and in launching counteroffensives to retake territory from the Axis. Without a strong naval presence, the U.S. would have been unable to project power across the Pacific, making it much more difficult to defend key islands like Hawaii and the Philippines. The Japanese could have expanded their control over the Pacific, forcing the U.S. to focus more heavily on defense rather than offense, while the Japanese military continued to strengthen its hold on the region. Furthermore, a crippled U.S. Navy would have undermined the effectiveness of American air power. The Navy's aircraft carriers played a central role in the Pacific War, serving as mobile air bases that allowed the U.S. to launch airstrikes across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Without this crucial naval support, the U.S. would have struggled to maintain air superiority in the Pacific, allowing Japan to continue its aggressive expansion and forcing the Allies to devote more resources to combating the Axis in the air. Finally, the lack of a strong U.S. Navy would have allowed the Axis powers to strengthen their naval and air forces with little resistance. Germany's Kriegsmarine and Japan's Imperial Navy would have faced less opposition in the Atlantic and Pacific, respectively, and the balance of power at sea would have tilted in favor of the Axis. With superior naval forces, the Axis could have posed a much greater threat to the U.S. and its allies, making it much harder for the Allies to maintain their strategic positions and ultimately leading to a prolonged war. In short, a crippled U.S. Navy would have severely hampered America's ability to wage war on both the European and Pacific fronts, dramatically altering the balance of power in favor of the Axis and potentially prolonging the war, if not changing its outcome altogether. A negotiated peace or full Axis victory? The possibility of a negotiated peace with the Axis powers during World War II, rather than a complete Allied victory, would have drastically altered the course of history. As the war progressed, particularly after key turning points like the Battle of Stalingrad or the U.S. entry into the conflict, the Axis powers found themselves increasingly on the defensive. However, had the Axis enjoyed a few more victories or avoided critical strategic errors, the idea of a negotiated peace settlement could have gained traction. The question then becomes, would the Axis powers have pursued such a peace, or would they have pushed for total victory? The notion of a negotiated peace with Germany, Italy, or Japan was something that had been discussed sporadically during the war. Some figures within the Axis, such as certain factions of the German military and political elites, were open to the idea of peace negotiations with the Allies, particularly if the war was not going in Germany's favor. The idea was often predicated on achieving an agreement that would allow Germany to maintain some of its territorial gains without facing complete defeat. For instance, if Britain had been forced to surrender or the U.S. had not fully committed to the European theater, it might have opened the door for a negotiated settlement with Germany, where the Allies could have accepted a status quo that left much of Europe under Nazi control. Similarly, Japan might have pursued a peace agreement if it had secured its territorial holdings in the Pacific, avoiding the decisive battles that led to its eventual defeat. In this scenario, the U.S. and Japan might have agreed to an armistice or a peace settlement that would leave Japan in control of its conquests, such as the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and parts of China. Such a peace could have seen Japan emerge as a dominant regional power without further conflict and without the U.S. intervening to challenge its territorial expansion. However, the prospect of a full Axis victory, where Germany, Italy, and Japan would dominate vast swaths of Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, would have had profound consequences for the world. Nazi Germany, with its ideology of racial supremacy and totalitarian rule, would have sought to establish a new world order, with the extermination or subjugation of millions of people, particularly Jews, Slavs, and other undesirables. Italy, under Mussolini, might have sought to expand its empire in Africa and the Mediterranean, while Japan would have sought to solidify its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, further consolidating its power in Asia. If the Axis powers had achieved full victory, the world would have been shaped by fascism and imperialism, and global governance would have been dominated by oppressive regimes. The consequences for freedom, human rights, and international relations would have been devastating, leading to a world that might have taken decades, if not centuries, to recover from the ravages of totalitarian rule. Ultimately, a negotiated peace could have allowed for some degree of stability, but the cost would have been the survival of oppressive regimes with no regard for human rights. A full Axis victory, on the other hand, would have sealed the fate of the world under the oppressive rule of fascist powers. Either scenario would have profoundly reshaped the 20th century, leading to a very different world order than the one that eventually emerged after the Allies' victory. Chapter 5: The Role of Technology and Weapons. Technology and weapons played a pivotal role in shaping the outcome of World War II, influencing everything from the strategies employed by the Axis and Allied powers to the ultimate victory of the Allies. As the war raged on, innovations in both military technology and weaponry often dictated the pace of battle, the ability to adapt to shifting circumstances, and ultimately, the direction of the war itself. In this alternate history, the question arises: what if these technological advances had been more fully embraced or deployed by the Axis powers? Would they have been able to reverse their fortunes? One of the most significant technological advancements of World War II was the development of advanced weaponry, including tanks, aircraft, and firearms. While the Allies were able to leverage their industrial capacities to produce large numbers of these weapons, the Axis powers also made significant strides. Germany, for instance, developed some of the most advanced tanks of the era, such as the Panther and the Tiger, which were formidable on the battlefield. However, strategic miscalculations and underutilization of these tanks often resulted in missed opportunities. Had the Germans focused more on the mass production and strategic deployment of their armored divisions, they might have been able to achieve greater successes in critical battles like Kursk, where the Allies inflicted heavy losses on the German forces. Aircraft technology also played a crucial role, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated planes capable of carrying out precision bombing, reconnaissance, and air superiority missions. Germany's Messerschmitt Bf 109 and later the advanced jet aircraft, such as the Me 262, provided formidable aerial power. However, the use of these jets was limited due to manufacturing delays and strategic decisions that prioritized other military needs. Had the Germans been able to deploy jets earlier in the war, they could have gained air superiority over the Allies, forcing a delay in the D-Day invasion and potentially altering the outcome of the European theater. Submarines, particularly the German U-boat fleet, were another technological asset that could have had a more decisive impact on the war. The Battle of the Atlantic was a critical struggle between the Axis and the Allies, with German U-boats attempting to sever supply lines between North America and Europe. In an alternate scenario, if the Germans had focused more on technological upgrades for their U-boats, such as enhanced sonar or more efficient torpedo systems, they could have further crippled the Allies' ability to supply their forces, potentially lengthening the war or forcing a negotiated peace. The development of the atomic bomb was perhaps the most game-changing technological advancement of the war. While the U.S. successfully developed and deployed the bomb against Japan, it was a race that could have been won by either side. If Germany or Japan had succeeded in developing nuclear weapons first, the balance of power would have shifted drastically. The use of such devastating weapons could have altered the entire scope of the war, potentially leading to an early end in favor of the Axis or making the war even more destructive. Technology and weapons were not only tools of destruction, but also influenced strategy, morale, and the very nature of warfare. Had the Axis powers been able to harness their technological potential more effectively, the Allied victory would have been far from guaranteed. And the course of history could have been rewritten. Axis advancements in warfare. During World War II, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, made significant advancements in warfare that were crucial to their early successes. These innovations spanned across several domains, including military strategy, technology, and weapon systems. While the Allies ultimately gained the upper hand, the Axis powers' early advancements in warfare posed serious challenges and set the stage for a prolonged conflict. Germany, in particular, was at the forefront of many of these advancements. One of the most notable was the development and deployment of blitzkrieg tactics, or lightning war. This strategy revolutionized military tactics by emphasizing speed, surprise, and the coordinated use of tanks, infantry, and air support. The rapid advance of German forces through France, Poland, and other European countries demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach, overwhelming defenders before they could mount a cohesive defense. Had Germany been able to maintain its momentum and continue applying blitzkrieg tactics more successfully on the Eastern Front, it could have disrupted Soviet defenses and accelerated its victories across Europe. In terms of technology, Germany also pioneered the development of advanced tanks and artillery. The iconic Panzer tanks, particularly the Panzer IV and the later Tiger tanks, were formidable on the battlefield. Their firepower, armor, and mobility made them a force to be reckoned with, especially when used in concentrated formations. The Germans also developed a variety of innovative weapons, including the V-2 rocket, which represented the first successful use of ballistic missiles. Though the V-2's impact on the war was limited, it demonstrated Germany's potential in advancing long-range weaponry, which would later influence the development of space programs in the post-war period. Japan, on the other hand, focused much of its technological advancements on naval warfare. The Japanese Imperial Navy's carrier-based forces, exemplified by the attack on Pearl Harbor, marked a dramatic shift in naval strategy. Japan's aircraft carriers, such as the Akagi and Kaga, were the backbone of its naval operations, allowing for powerful long-range strikes far from home shores. The Japanese also made advancements in submarine warfare, with their submarines playing a critical role in disrupting Allied shipping and conducting offensive operations across the Pacific. Italy, though often overshadowed by its Axis partners, also contributed to the development of new weapons, particularly in the realm of naval warfare. The Italian Navy's innovations included the use of torpedo bombers and midget submarines, which allowed for unconventional tactics in naval engagements. While the impact of these advancements was less pronounced than those of Germany and Japan, they represented Italy's attempts to leverage its position within the Axis to challenge the Allies in the Mediterranean. Despite these advancements, the Axis powers ultimately failed to sustain their technological and strategic advantages. Germany's focus on developing advanced weaponry and tactics often resulted in an overextension of resources, and Japan's dependence on naval superiority eventually faltered as the U.S. adapted and began to outproduce them. Nonetheless, the early advancements in warfare by the Axis powers highlight the significant challenges they posed to the Allied forces and underscore the complexity of the conflict. Had these advancements been implemented more strategically and sustained over time, the course of the war might have taken a very different turn. Could Germany have built the atomic bomb first? The possibility of Germany developing the atomic bomb before the Allies is a key question in any alternative history of World War II. The German nuclear program, which was initiated early in the war, was ambitious but faced several significant hurdles that ultimately prevented its success. However, if certain conditions had been different, it's conceivable that Germany could have developed the bomb before the United States, which would have radically altered the course of the war and world history. The German nuclear program, often referred to as the Uranium Project, began as early as 1938. Leading physicists like Otto Hahn, Fritz Strassmann, and Werner Heisenberg were among the first to investigate nuclear fission, the process that would later be harnessed for the atomic bomb. Despite initial progress, several factors hindered the development of the bomb. First, there was a lack of focused coordination between military and scientific efforts. Unlike the United States, where the Manhattan Project consolidated resources and talent under a single, highly secretive effort, Germany's nuclear research was fragmented, with multiple competing institutions and little central direction. Additionally, Germany's approach to nuclear research was constrained by a lack of resources, both in terms of uranium and the necessary infrastructure to process it at scale. The Allies controlled key uranium supplies in countries like the Belgian Congo, while Germany struggled to secure sufficient raw materials. Moreover, Germany's strategic focus on conventional warfare, especially on the Eastern Front and in the Battle of Britain, meant that the resources and manpower needed for a successful nuclear program were spread thin. Another significant obstacle for Germany was the scientific brain drain. Many of Germany's leading scientists, including Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, fled the country after the rise of the Nazi regime. Some of these scientists, like Szilard, played crucial roles in the development of the atomic bomb in the United States. Had they remained in Germany, the program may have benefited from their expertise and international collaborations, potentially accelerating its progress. In contrast, the United States Manhattan Project, which was initiated in 1942, consolidated the best minds in nuclear physics and allocated enormous resources to the development of the bomb. The United States had access to vast quantities of raw materials, a highly efficient scientific network, and the ability to maintain secrecy on an unprecedented scale. By 1945, the U.S. successfully tested the first atomic bomb, while Germany had not yet achieved a working prototype. However, it is not entirely out of the realm of possibility that, had the German program been better coordinated, better resourced, and led by scientists with fewer ideological constraints, they might have developed the atomic bomb first. If the Axis powers had secured greater access to uranium, focused their scientific efforts, and had more time free from the stresses of war, it's conceivable that the war could have ended in a vastly different way, with Germany holding the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. In conclusion, while Germany's nuclear program was hindered by a variety of internal and external factors, a more streamlined and focused effort might have allowed them to build the bomb first. If that had occurred, the impact on the war's outcome would have been profound, potentially leading to a negotiated peace or a more dominant Axis victory. The atomic bomb could have been the deciding factor in the global conflict, marking a pivotal moment in history. The effect of jet fighters and superweapons. The introduction of jet fighters and superweapons during World War II marked a dramatic shift in the nature of combat and warfare. These technological advancements not only changed the dynamics of air superiority, but also altered the way battles were fought on the ground and at sea. In an alternate scenario, where the Axis powers had successfully developed and deployed these technologies more effectively, the course of the war could have been radically different. Jet fighters, particularly Germany's Messerschmitt Me 262, were among the most advanced weapons developed during the war. While the Me 262 entered service too late to have a significant impact on the outcome of the conflict, it demonstrated the potential of jet propulsion in combat aircraft. The jet's speed and firepower made it a formidable opponent, capable of outpacing Allied bombers and fighters. Had the Germans been able to mass-produce the Me 262 earlier and deploy it in greater numbers, it could have shifted the balance of power in the air. The ability to challenge the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied aircraft would have made the Allied bombing campaign over Europe much more difficult and costly. A sustained German air presence could have delayed or even prevented the D-Day invasion, altering the timeline of the war in Europe. Superweapons, on the other hand, were another area where the Axis powers made significant strides. Germany's V-2 rockets, for example, represented the first successful use of ballistic missile technology. Although their impact on the war was limited, the V-2 rockets symbolized the potential of long-range weaponry, a development that would later influence space exploration. If the Germans had been able to mass-produce these rockets and use them more strategically, they could have inflicted greater damage on Allied infrastructure, cities, and military targets. The psychological impact of an unstoppable high-tech weapon could have undermined Allied morale, making the Axis powers' position in the war stronger. Another example of a potential superweapon was Japan's work on developing a long-range bomber capable of striking the U.S. mainland. Had Japan been able to develop such a weapon and carry out attacks on American soil, it could have significantly disrupted U.S. war production and morale. This, combined with the use of advanced submarines and aircraft, might have prolonged the war or forced the United States to reconsider its commitment to the Pacific theater. Ultimately, the effect of jet fighters and superweapons on the outcome of World War II would have been profound. If the Axis powers had exploited these technological innovations more effectively, the Allies would have faced a much tougher fight. The introduction of faster, more powerful weapons could have altered the strategic calculations of both sides, potentially resulting in a negotiated peace or a very different post-war world order. The war might have continued longer, or the balance of power could have shifted in favor of the Axis, depending on how these technologies were deployed. Chapter 6: The Axis in the Middle East and Africa. The Middle East and North Africa, MENA, were crucial theaters of conflict during World War II, serving as strategic battlegrounds that could either facilitate or hinder the ambitions of the Axis powers. Both regions offered critical resources, such as oil, and held significant geopolitical importance. In an alternate history where the Axis powers had gained a stronger foothold in these regions, the course of the war and the post-war balance of power could have been dramatically altered. Germany's interest in the Middle East was driven primarily by the need to secure oil supplies. The Nazis, under Adolf Hitler, understood that control of the oil fields in the region would provide them with the necessary resources to continue their war effort, especially as their access to oil supplies in the Soviet Union was cut off after the failure of Operation Barbarossa. In this alternate scenario, if the Axis had been more successful in securing the Middle East, it could have deprived the Allies, particularly the British, of vital resources that fueled their military machinery. This could have delayed Allied offensives in North Africa and the Mediterranean and weakened the overall Allied war effort. One of the most significant opportunities for the Axis in the region was the North African Campaign, where the German Afrika Korps, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, fought against British and Commonwealth forces. In our history, the Axis powers were unable to secure a decisive victory in North Africa due to logistical challenges, lack of resources, and the eventual Allied counteroffensive. However, if the Axis had managed to maintain their momentum and captured key strategic points, such as the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields, it would have significantly disrupted Allied supply lines to the Mediterranean and India. The fall of Egypt and the Suez Canal would have provided Germany with a direct route to the Middle East and Asia, opening up new fronts and weakening the British Empire's influence in the region. Additionally, a stronger Axis presence in Africa could have had broader consequences for colonial territories. With the British Empire stretched thin and preoccupied with the Axis threat, it would have been more difficult to maintain control over its colonies in Africa and Asia. This may have encouraged nationalist movements, leading to greater instability in these regions and a shift in the balance of colonial power. Japan, in this alternate scenario, could have benefited from Axis success in the Middle East and Africa by gaining access to vital resources for its own war effort. The Japanese Empire was heavily dependent on imports of oil, rubber, and other materials, which were increasingly cut off by Allied blockades. If the Axis had secured these regions, Japan's resource needs could have been met, potentially allowing them to prolong their campaigns in the Pacific. In conclusion, the Middle East and North Africa represented an untapped strategic resource for the Axis powers. Had they been more successful in these regions, they could have severely hampered Allied efforts and shifted the balance of the war. The importance of oil and the control of key geographical choke points would have been decisive factors, and in this alternate history, the Axis could have gained a significant advantage that might have prolonged the war or altered its ultimate outcome. Securing oil resources for the Reich. One of the most critical strategic objectives for Nazi Germany during World War II was securing access to vital oil resources. Oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare, fueling tanks, planes, and ships, as well as providing energy for industrial production. For the Axis powers, especially Germany, which lacked sufficient domestic oil reserves, controlling oil-rich regions was crucial to sustaining military operations and ensuring the success of their campaigns. Had Germany been able to secure key oil resources, the course of the war could have been dramatically altered. Germany's main sources of oil were limited. Before the war, the country relied on imports, particularly from Romania's Ploiești oil fields, which were among the largest in Europe. However, as the war escalated, the Allied forces targeted these sources, and Germany's ability to access oil became increasingly strained. As the conflict moved eastward, Adolf Hitler realized that securing the vast oil resources in the Caucasus region, particularly the oil fields around Baku, was a top priority. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, was partially motivated by the desire to control these critical oil supplies. In an alternate history, where the Axis powers had successfully captured the oil-rich Caucasus region and maintained access to these resources, Germany would have gained a significant strategic advantage. The ability to fuel its war machine with a steady supply of oil would have allowed for longer and more sustained military campaigns, particularly on the Eastern Front. This could have facilitated a more effective siege of Stalingrad or a stronger German push toward the Caspian Sea, potentially altering the outcome of the war in the East. Another key oil resource was the Middle East, particularly the oil fields in Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. If the Axis had been able to secure control over these areas, they would have gained direct access to some of the largest oil reserves in the world. This would have not only helped Germany, but also provided vital resources to Italy and Japan, both of which were struggling with resource shortages. In this scenario, the Axis powers could have used their newfound oil wealth to strengthen their naval fleets, increase production of weapons, and sustain their military operations across multiple theaters of war. However, Germany's attempts to secure oil were fraught with difficulties. Even when they gained ground in oil-rich areas, the Germans faced challenges in maintaining control over these regions due to the vast distances, harsh terrain, and stiff local resistance. Additionally, the Allies worked tirelessly to disrupt Axis oil supplies, targeting refineries and transportation infrastructure. A prolonged struggle for oil could have ultimately drained Axis resources, limiting their ability to maintain a lasting advantage. In conclusion, securing oil resources was one of the most critical objectives for Nazi Germany during World War II. Had the Axis powers gained control over key oil fields in the Soviet Union and the Middle East, it would have provided them with the necessary resources to sustain their war effort and potentially alter the outcome of the conflict. Access to these resources could have allowed the Axis to outlast the Allies, extending the war and giving Germany a significant strategic advantage. Ultimately, Oil was not only a key to military success, but also a deciding factor in the overall outcome of the war. Rommel's success in North Africa. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, was one of the most iconic military commanders of World War II. His campaigns in North Africa were characterized by bold strategies, rapid movements, and tactical brilliance. Rommel's success in the North African theater played a pivotal role in the Axis attempt to control vital resources and strategic positions in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Had Rommel achieved greater success in North Africa, the course of the war might have shifted significantly, particularly in the Mediterranean and the broader strategic landscape of World War II. Rommel's initial success in North Africa came after his arrival in 1941, when he took command of the Afrika Corps, sent by Hitler to assist the Italians who were struggling against the British Eighth Army. His ability to use the desert terrain to his advantage, combined with his innovative tactics, helped the Axis forces achieve a series of victories. Rommel's use of fast-moving tank and mechanized infantry units, supported by Luftwaffe air superiority, allowed him to outmaneuver and surprise the British forces, leading to the capture of key positions in Libya and Egypt. The most significant of these victories was the capture of Tobruk in June 1942, a major Allied supply and logistics hub which severely disrupted British operations in North Africa. Rommel's brilliance lay in his ability to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. His deep understanding of mobile warfare, combined with his willingness to take risks, earned him the admiration of both his allies and enemies. However, his success was also a result of favorable circumstances, including a lack of adequate British preparation and the early underestimation of his capabilities by Allied command. Despite these early victories, Rommel faced significant challenges in maintaining the momentum of his campaigns. His forces were consistently undermanned and undersupplied, particularly in terms of fuel and ammunition, which were critical in desert warfare. The long supply lines, harsh desert conditions, and growing Allied resistance gradually eroded his advantages. The arrival of fresh Allied reinforcements, including the U.S. Army, and the success of Operation Torch in November 1942, which landed Allied forces in French North Africa, marked the beginning of the Axis retreat. In an alternate history where Rommel's forces had been better supplied and reinforced, it is conceivable that he could have achieved a more decisive victory in North Africa. With control of the Suez Canal and the oil-rich Middle East in German hands, the Axis powers would have secured a vital lifeline for their war effort, potentially depriving the Allies of crucial resources. Additionally, the strategic control of North Africa would have put the Axis in a stronger position to challenge Allied shipping and reinforce their Mediterranean campaigns. Ultimately, Rommel's success in North Africa could have played a decisive role in the Axis powers' ability to sustain their war effort. Had Rommel's victories been fully realized, the balance of power in the Mediterranean and the broader war effort would have shifted, potentially extending the war and changing the ultimate outcome. A Southern front against the USSR. The idea of opening a Southern front against the Soviet Union was a strategic consideration that could have altered the course of World War II on the Eastern Front. After the initial success of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Germans found themselves stretched thin across the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. While the focus was on advancing towards Moscow and the industrial heartlands of the Soviet Union, a secondary front in the south, targeting the oil-rich Caucasus region, presented both a significant opportunity and a potential pitfall. One of the main strategic objectives for Nazi Germany in the Soviet Union was to seize the valuable oil fields in the Caucasus, particularly around Baku. Control of these resources would have provided the Axis powers with the oil necessary to sustain their war machine, and could have significantly disrupted Soviet industrial production. The oil-rich areas of the Caucasus were essential to the Soviet Union's ability to continue fighting and to supply their tanks, planes, and trucks. If Germany had managed to push southward and capture these fields, it could have dealt a devastating blow to Soviet capabilities, limiting their ability to resist Axis advances. However, the idea of a southern front was fraught with logistical difficulties. The vast distances involved in a southern push, coupled with the difficult terrain, would have stretched the German supply lines even further. Moreover, the German forces would have had to contend with harsh weather conditions, difficult mountainous terrain, and a determined Soviet resistance. The German army, already weakened by the fierce fighting in the north, would have faced even greater challenges in this new theater of war. An additional complication for the Germans was the need to coordinate their southern front with the main thrust toward Moscow. In our history, Hitler's decision to split his forces between the central and southern fronts during the summer of 1942 led to disastrous results. If the Germans had fully committed to a southern offensive and focused their efforts on securing the Caucasus, they might have had a better chance of cutting off Soviet oil supplies. The resulting disruption to Soviet logistics could have hindered the Red Army's counteroffensive and delayed the ultimate Soviet victory. A southern front would also have had implications beyond the Soviet Union. The Balkans and Turkey were significant geopolitical players in the region, and Germany's push southward could have affected its relations with these countries. A successful German advance into the Caucasus would have put additional pressure on the British in the Middle East and India, potentially diverting resources and attention from their campaigns in North Africa and the Mediterranean. In conclusion, opening a southern front against the Soviet Union could have altered the balance of power on the Eastern Front. By securing the Caucasus oil fields and disrupting Soviet logistics, the Axis powers might have prolonged their war effort. However, the challenges of logistics, terrain, and coordination would have made this a risky endeavor, and the ultimate success of such a strategy would depend on Germany's ability to marshal its resources and maintain pressure on both the Soviet Union and its other enemies. Chapter 7: The Role of Italy and Japan. While Germany is often seen as the dominant Axis power during World War II, the roles of Italy and Japan were pivotal in shaping the course of the conflict. These two nations contributed both strategically and materially to the Axis cause, though their involvement was often marked by challenges, inconsistencies, and differing objectives. Understanding their roles provides insight into the dynamics of the Axis powers and how their successes or failures influenced the war's outcome. Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, initially sought to expand its territorial holdings, aiming to create a new Roman Empire across the Mediterranean and Africa. Italy's involvement in the war was marked by several failed military campaigns, most notably in North Africa and Greece. Mussolini's ambitions often stretched Italy's resources thin, and his forces struggled to match Germany's military might. However, Italy's strategic importance lay in its control of vital Mediterranean territories and its alliance with Nazi Germany. Italy's geographical position gave the Axis a key base of operations in southern Europe and North Africa, enabling them to challenge Allied positions in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Moreover, Italy's navy, though inferior to Britain's, still posed a threat to Allied shipping routes, while its presence in North Africa opened up potential resources, including oil fields in Libya. However, Italy's military shortcomings and lack of coordination with Germany often hampered the Axis war effort. Mussolini's failure to secure significant victories in North Africa and his early misadventures in Greece and Egypt exposed Italy's vulnerability. Germany had to intervene repeatedly to stabilize the Italian position, especially during the Battle of El Alamein and the Italian campaign. In an alternate history where Italy had been more successful, particularly in North Africa or the Balkans, the Axis could have further disrupted Allied logistics and potentially altered the outcome of the war in the Mediterranean. Japan, on the other hand, had a clearer and more strategic vision for its role in the Axis alliance. Japan's expansionist ambitions were focused on East Asia and the Pacific, where it sought to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a region dominated by Japanese influence and resources. Japan's early successes, including the rapid conquest of China and the attack on Pearl Harbor, were key moments that brought the United States into the war. Japan's desire to secure raw materials, such as oil, rubber, and tin, drove its aggressive campaigns in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. While Japan's military successes were initially overwhelming, the country faced several strategic challenges that limited its long-term impact on the war. The most significant of these was Japan's inability to decisively lead the United States and its allies in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway, for instance, marked a turning point where Japan's losses in aircraft carriers and experienced pilots severely weakened its ability to wage war against the United States. Additionally, Japan's focus on regional expansion and its lack of coordination with Germany and Italy led to missed opportunities for Axis cooperation. In conclusion, the roles of Italy and Japan were critical to the Axis strategy during World War II, but their failures to effectively coordinate and achieve lasting victories limited their contributions. Had Italy and Japan been more successful in their respective campaigns, the Axis might have been able to prolong the war and create additional challenges for the Allies. However, their military limitations and strategic missteps ultimately played a crucial part in the Axis defeat. Mussolini's alternate path to success. Benito Mussolini's path to success in World War II was marred by military failures, strategic miscalculations, and his dependency on Adolf Hitler's Germany. However, had Mussolini pursued a different course of action, with more strategic foresight and better management of Italy's military resources, the outcome of Italy's role in the war could have been significantly altered. An alternate path for Mussolini could have seen Italy rise as a dominant force in Europe and the Mediterranean, with broader implications for the Axis powers' chances of victory. One of Mussolini's major missteps was his overconfidence and desire to expand Italy's empire prematurely. Italy's involvement in the war began with a series of ambitious yet ill-prepared invasions, most notably in Greece and North Africa. Had Mussolini taken a more cautious approach and focused on securing Italy's current territories, he could have strengthened his position in the Mediterranean and avoided overextending his forces. A more focused strategy would have allowed Italy to shore up its defenses, particularly in Libya, and potentially force the Allies to divert more resources to contain Italy's power in the region. Another key element of Mussolini's alternate success would have been maintaining a more independent position within the Axis alliance. Mussolini's decision to align too closely with Hitler, at the expense of Italy's own interests, weakened Italy's ability to act autonomously. If Mussolini had resisted the influence of Nazi Germany, he could have pursued a diplomatic strategy that preserved Italy's sovereignty and avoided the costly and unnecessary commitments to war. By seeking a more neutral stance, while maintaining an alliance with Germany, Mussolini could have kept Italy out of direct conflict with the Allies, possibly securing a favorable position post-war. In North Africa, Mussolini's strategic focus could have been centered around consolidating control over Egypt and the Suez Canal. Had Italy strengthened its hold on Libya and used it as a base to exert pressure on British forces in Egypt, the Axis could have gained control of the critical Suez Canal. This would have disrupted Allied supply lines, potentially delaying or preventing the Allied invasion of North Africa and further challenging Britain's position in the Mediterranean. Furthermore, Mussolini could have sought to exploit Italy's geographical position to play a more central role in the Mediterranean theater. By focusing on maintaining control over the Balkans, securing North Africa, and using Italy's naval strength to challenge Allied shipping, Mussolini could have turned Italy into a formidable Mediterranean power, undermining Britain's ability to sustain operations in the region. Had Mussolini successfully navigated these alternative paths, avoiding overextension, seeking greater independence from Germany, and focusing on Italy's strategic position in the Mediterranean, he could have achieved lasting success. With control over key Mediterranean territories, particularly Egypt, the Suez Canal, and parts of the Balkans, Mussolini would have significantly altered the balance of power, potentially prolonging the war and altering the course of the conflict in the Axis' favor. A more coordinated Axis strategy. A more coordinated Axis strategy could have been a game changer during World War II, potentially altering the entire outcome of the conflict. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, often acted independently, each pursuing its own goals without sufficient coordination. This lack of strategic unity undermined their collective strength and created opportunities for the Allies to exploit. Had the Axis nations coordinated their military efforts more effectively, particularly in terms of their goals, resources, and timing, the war could have played out very differently. One of the main areas where a more coordinated strategy would have been beneficial was in the communication and cooperation between Germany and Italy. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, while initially successful, was stretched thin by the simultaneous need to support Italy's campaigns in North Africa and Greece. If the Axis powers had agreed on a unified approach to both the Eastern and Western fronts, it would have allowed Germany to fully concentrate on its efforts in the Soviet Union, potentially leading to a quicker victory. Italy could have taken a more defensive position in the Mediterranean, allowing German forces to better focus on their objectives without the added pressure of aiding Italy's failures. In addition to Germany and Italy, the role of Japan in the Axis strategy could have been more integrated into the broader European war effort. Japan's initial success in the Pacific, particularly its attack on Pearl Harbor, drew the United States into the conflict, creating a significant distraction for the Allies. However, Japan's lack of coordination with Germany and Italy left them fighting separate battles in distant theaters. If Japan had launched simultaneous attacks on the British Empire's holdings in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, while Germany and Italy expanded their operations in the Mediterranean and the Eastern Front, the Allies would have been forced to divert their resources and manpower to multiple regions. This could have delayed the Allied victory and stretched their military capabilities. The Axis powers could have also shared resources more effectively. Germany, for instance, could have provided Japan with advanced technology, such as aircraft and submarines, to enhance its naval capabilities. In exchange, Japan could have offered Germany access to critical resources from its conquests in Southeast Asia. A more symbiotic relationship between the Axis nations would have allowed for greater efficiency in production and more robust military campaigns. Ultimately, the success of a more coordinated Axis strategy would have depended on clear communication, a shared vision for post-war goals, and the ability to adapt to shifting circumstances. If the Axis powers had acted as a unified bloc with a more synchronized military strategy, they would have posed a much greater challenge to the Allies and could have prolonged the war, or potentially changed its outcome. Japan's role in securing global dominance. Japan's role in securing global dominance during World War II was primarily focused on its expansionist goals in East Asia and the Pacific. With its desire to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan sought to create a self-sufficient empire by controlling key territories rich in natural resources. By attacking and occupying countries such as China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, Japan aimed to assert itself as a regional superpower and undermine the influence of Western powers in the region. Japan's military successes in the early years of the war demonstrated its ambition to challenge global powers. The swift attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 led to the United States' entry into the war and allowed Japan to seize vital territories, including the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan's strategy was based on the belief that controlling these regions would provide the empire with the necessary resources, such as oil, rubber, and tin, to fuel its military-industrial complex and sustain its war efforts. Japan's naval strength, particularly its carrier fleet, played a crucial role in securing its initial dominance across the Pacific. By engaging in lightning-fast operations and capturing key territories, Japan was able to establish a formidable defensive perimeter. The rapid expansion allowed Japan to control vital shipping routes and disrupt Allied supply lines, weakening the ability of the United States and its allies to counterattack. This initial dominance was key to Japan's long-term objective of isolating and undermining Western influence in the Pacific. However, Japan's overextension proved to be one of the main factors that eventually led to its downfall. Despite its early successes, Japan's focus on territorial expansion in the Pacific began to stretch its resources thin. The Battle of Midway in 1942 marked a critical turning point as Japan lost key aircraft carriers and experienced a shift in momentum. The United States, with its superior industrial capacity and military strategy, gradually turned the tide in the Pacific. Had Japan been able to maintain its early momentum and prevent critical defeats like Midway, its path toward global dominance could have been more realistic. A more calculated approach in managing its territorial holdings and military resources might have allowed Japan to establish a stronger foothold in Asia and the Pacific, delaying or even preventing the eventual Allied victory. In conclusion, Japan's role in securing global dominance was defined by its aggressive expansionism, naval strength, and desire to control vital resources. While Japan's early successes demonstrated its ability to challenge global powers, its inability to maintain strategic momentum ultimately limited its chances of achieving lasting dominance. If Japan had been able to consolidate its gains and focus on consolidating power rather than stretching its military capabilities, it could have significantly altered the global balance of power. Chapter 8: Resistance Movements and Unfinished Wars. Resistance movements played a crucial role in the conflict during World War II, as many countries occupied by the Axis powers saw groups rise up to challenge their invaders. While these movements varied in size, strength, and effectiveness, their efforts contributed to the overall struggle against Axis dominance. Their role, however, was not just about fighting the occupiers. They also symbolized the resilience of nations and the unyielding spirit to reclaim sovereignty. Had the Axis powers secured victory, the unfinished wars within these occupied countries would have continued to shape a very different post-war world. In countries like France, Poland, and Yugoslavia, resistance movements actively sabotaged Axis supply lines, gathered intelligence for the Allies, and participated in covert operations. For instance, the French resistance worked tirelessly to gather intelligence for the Allies, particularly during D-Day preparations. Likewise, partisan groups in Eastern Europe, including the Soviet-backed partisans in Belarus and the Polish Home Army, waged guerrilla warfare against German forces. These movements were often small but determined, sometimes relying on the support of local populations who provided shelter, food, and information. However, the strength of these resistance efforts was often limited by the overwhelming power of the Axis occupiers. The Nazis, in particular, had a sophisticated intelligence network and brutal repressive methods. In many cases, entire villages were destroyed as punishment for helping resistance groups, and thousands of civilians were executed in retaliation. Despite these efforts, the Axis powers' grip on occupied territories remained strong throughout much of the war, and these resistance movements were often faced with severe consequences for their actions. The role of resistance movements was not only military, it was also ideological. They represented the refusal to accept the Axis vision of a new world order and were symbols of defiance in the face of tyranny. In some areas, the resistance movements were able to secure temporary victories, forcing the Axis to divert resources to quell uprisings and unrest. This drew attention away from larger strategic operations and created an ongoing challenge for the Axis powers. Had the Axis powers been successful in the war, the resistance movements may have continued to wage their own unfinished wars, becoming more deeply embedded in the societal fabric of their countries. The ongoing resistance could have served as a thorn in the side of an Axis-dominated Europe, continuously undermining the totalitarian control that the Axis sought to enforce. The long-term effects of these movements would likely have fueled the eventual struggles for independence and sovereignty once the Axis powers began to weaken. In conclusion, the resistance movements were critical in maintaining hope and defiance against the Axis powers during World War II. While many of their efforts were thwarted, their resilience played a pivotal role in the broader Allied war effort and would have continued to influence the post-war landscape, even if victory had tilted in favor of the Axis. The fate of occupied Europe. The fate of occupied Europe in the event of an Axis victory would have been marked by the continued oppression, exploitation, and control exerted by Nazi Germany and its allies. In a scenario where the Axis powers succeeded in winning World War II, the political, social, and economic landscape of Europe would have been radically different, with far-reaching consequences for the continent's future. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler's regime, had already outlined plans for the total restructuring of Europe in line with its ideology of racial superiority. The Nazi vision for Europe involved the establishment of a greater Germanic Reich, where the populations of Eastern Europe, including Slavs, Jews, and other groups deemed undesirable, would be either eliminated or enslaved. In this world, Europe's cities and infrastructures would be repurposed to serve German interests, while vast swathes of the population would be subjected to systematic persecution and extermination. In the occupied countries, the fate of the people would have been grim. Countries like Poland, Ukraine, and Russia were expected to provide both resources and labor for the German war effort. For these populations, the Axis victory meant widespread displacement, forced labor, and extermination on an unprecedented scale. The Holocaust, which had already claimed the lives of millions of Jews, would have continued, with more ethnic and political groups falling victim to Nazi death camps and genocide. In Western Europe, countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands would likely have faced a prolonged period of occupation. These nations would have been under tight control, with local governments replaced by pro-Nazi collaborators or puppet regimes. The Axis powers, particularly Germany, would have used these countries as economic vassals to support the war machine. The resistance movements that had flourished during the war would likely have been crushed, and any attempts at rebellion or insurrection would have been ruthlessly suppressed. In addition to the horrors of occupation, the social fabric of Europe would have been deeply altered. With the Axis powers in control, the continent's cultural diversity would have been replaced by a homogenized society built around Nazi ideals. Intellectual and cultural life would have been heavily censored, with any anti-Nazi or anti-fascist ideologies forbidden. European universities, art institutions, and media outlets would have been transformed to reflect the principles of Nazi propaganda, stifling free thought and creativity. Economically, Europe's resources would have been exploited to feed the German war machine. Key industries would have been seized, and food and raw materials would have been funneled to support Germany's military goals. The continent's economies would have been decimated, with much of the workforce being used for forced labor, while the rest of the population faced extreme shortages of goods and services. In conclusion, the fate of occupied Europe in an Axis-dominated world would have been one of destruction, repression, and exploitation. The war-torn continent would have been reshaped into a totalitarian society, with vast areas depopulated and transformed to serve the interests of the Axis powers. This dark future would have marked Europe's decline into an era of enduring hardship and suffering under fascist rule. Could resistance have turned the tide? Resistance movements in occupied Europe during World War II played a vital role in undermining the Axis powers. Their impact was felt both on the battlefield and within the political landscape, even if their efforts were often limited by the overwhelming strength of the Nazi and Axis forces. In a world where the Axis won, it's worth considering whether these movements could have eventually turned the tide of the war or significantly altered its outcome. The resistance, from the well-organized groups in France to the more dispersed cells in Eastern Europe, primarily focused on intelligence gathering, sabotage, and harassing enemy troops. These activities did indeed slow the Axis war effort, drawing resources away from critical fronts and forcing Germany to commit more troops to suppression. However, in the face of an Axis-dominated Europe, resistance movements operated in a dangerous environment, where the threat of severe reprisals, including mass executions and the destruction of villages, was ever present. Despite this, their resilience was a symbol of defiance and a constant challenge to Axis control. The question remains, though, could the resistance have realistically turned the tide of the war had the Axis powers remained victorious? It's difficult to imagine a small group of fighters in the face of such a massive war machine being able to single-handedly change the course of history. However, if these movements had been better coordinated, or if they had received more substantial support from the Allies, it's possible they could have had a greater impact. In an alternative history, where the resistance had the resources, coordination, and strategy of a fully supported insurgency, the Axis powers might have found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over occupied territories. Furthermore, the role of the resistance wasn't just limited to military action. They also served as a rallying point for the occupied populations, keeping hope alive and demonstrating that not all was lost. The psychological impact of widespread resistance could have been far-reaching, weakening the morale of Axis forces and even sowing dissent among collaborators. However, it's important to recognize the immense challenges the resistance faced. The resources required for a coordinated effort across the continent were vast, and without significant external help, turning the tide of the war would have been unlikely. Still, the resistance movements were not without their successes. They significantly hampered Axis plans, delayed key operations, and played an indispensable role in the eventual liberation of Europe. Even in an Axis-dominated world, their legacy would have lived on as a symbol of the unbroken will of the oppressed. In conclusion, while it is unlikely that resistance movements alone could have fully turned the tide of the war, they were nonetheless a crucial element in the fight against Axis control. Their efforts contributed to the overall weakening of the Axis powers, and in an alternative history, their impact could have been far more significant with better coordination and support. Managing long-term control over vast territories. Managing long-term control over vast territories was one of the most formidable challenges the Axis powers would have faced had they emerged victorious in World War II. While Nazi Germany, in particular, had grand ambitions for territorial expansion across Europe and beyond, the logistical, administrative, and social challenges of holding these vast and diverse lands would have been immense. In a world where the Axis won, the management of occupied territories would have been primarily focused on exploiting resources, maintaining control through repression, and suppressing any resistance movements. The Axis powers, especially Nazi Germany, would have sought to implement policies that would allow them to extract the maximum benefit from these regions while minimizing the risks of uprisings and unrest. This required a highly organized, centralized system that could effectively govern diverse populations with different cultures, languages, and political systems. Nazi Germany's vision for the future of its empire included the establishment of a Greater Germanic Reich, with plans for the systematic extermination, enslavement, or deportation of millions of people in Eastern Europe. For territories like Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, The Germans had already implemented brutal policies of suppression and control, intending to resettle the land with racially superior Germans. In the long term, the challenge of managing such a vast, multi-ethnic empire would have led to widespread resistance and unrest, undermining efforts to maintain stability. The sheer size of the territories, combined with the relentless exploitation of resources, would have made it difficult for the Axis powers to maintain control over such a sprawling empire without facing constant insurgency. On the other hand, Italy and Japan, as junior partners in the Axis, would have also faced the immense challenge of controlling their respective conquests in North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. For Italy, managing territories in North Africa would have been especially difficult due to the desert environment, tribal resistances, and the strategic importance of controlling the Suez Canal and oil-rich regions. Japan, on the other hand, would have faced the logistical difficulty of maintaining control over vast oceanic territories and managing the diverse cultures and resources in the Pacific Islands. Furthermore, in a world where the Axis maintained control over vast territories, internal divisions among the Axis powers themselves could have become a significant issue. Conflicts over resources, territorial disputes, and competing national interests might have strained the alliances and led to instability within the Axis-controlled territories. In conclusion, while the Axis powers may have been able to maintain control over these vast territories initially, the long-term sustainability of their empire would have been fraught with challenges. Resistance movements, internal divisions, and the immense logistical demands of controlling such vast and diverse lands would have continually tested their ability to hold power. Ultimately, the difficulty of managing these territories could have undermined the long-term success of an Axis-dominated world. Chapter 9, The New World Order. The vision of a New World Order under Axis rule was one of totalitarian dominance, marked by the imposition of authoritarian regimes and the subjugation of entire populations. In this alternative future, the Axis powers, primarily Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan, would have reshaped the global order, turning the world into a sprawling empire of oppression and exploitation. Nazi Germany's vision for the world revolved around the establishment of a greater Germanic Reich, a vast empire that would dominate Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Africa. Under Hitler's ideology, the goal was not just territorial expansion, but the creation of a new racial hierarchy where Aryans were at the top, and Slavs, Jews, and other groups were deemed inferior. The conquest of the Soviet Union would have provided Germany with vast resources, particularly oil and grain, and solidified its position as the world's dominant power. For the Axis powers, the concept of a new world order would have meant the eradication of democracy, individual freedoms, and the global systems of governance established by the Allies. The United Nations would never have come into existence, and international diplomacy would have been conducted at the whim of the Axis powers. The concept of national sovereignty would have been obliterated, as countries were forcibly incorporated into the Axis sphere of influence or controlled by puppet governments loyal to Germany, Italy, and Japan. In Asia, Japan would have aimed to create its own empire, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which sought to dominate China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Japan's vision for its new world was built on the exploitation of local resources and the subjugation of indigenous populations. Under this order, Japan would have been the regional hegemon, with a system of military control and exploitation that was no less brutal than Germany's in Europe. Economically, the New World would have been organized to serve the needs of the Axis powers. The Axis would have imposed systems of resource extraction, forced labor, and industrial output that benefited only the Axis countries. Economies around the world would have been restructured to ensure that all resources, be it oil, food, or raw materials, were funneled into the war machine or used to support the needs of the Axis elite. Socially, This world order would have been marked by extreme inequality. A small, elite group of Axis leaders and collaborators would have ruled, while the majority of the population would have been subjected to brutal repression. The cultural and intellectual diversity of the pre-war world would have been erased, as Nazi ideology sought to homogenize and purify societies. Resistance to the new order would have been met with harsh reprisals, and dissenters would be silenced or exterminated. In conclusion, a world governed by the Axis powers would have been a grim, dystopian place. The New World Order would have been characterized by widespread oppression, brutal exploitation, and the total elimination of political freedoms. The global system would have been transformed into a hierarchical, totalitarian empire, where the Axis powers were at the top and all others existed to serve their needs. How Axis rule might have been structured. The structure of Axis rule in a world where they emerged victorious in World War II would have been defined by authoritarian control, centralized power, and a rigid hierarchy designed to ensure complete dominance over vast territories and populations. The Axis powers, primarily Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan, would have exercised control through a combination of military occupation, puppet governments, and brutal repression, with a goal to solidify their power through both political and social means. At the top of the structure would have been the leadership of the Axis powers, with Adolf Hitler as the undisputed ruler of the Greater Germanic Reich. His vision of a totalitarian state would have permeated all aspects of governance, with centralized decision-making controlled by a small, elite group of Nazi officials. The Führer principle, which prioritized the absolute authority of the leader, would have been reinforced through a network of ministries, such as the SS and Gestapo, that enforced conformity and eliminated any dissent. Below Germany's central power, the newly conquered territories would have been governed by a combination of direct military rule, local puppet governments, and appointed officials loyal to the Reich. In regions like Poland, the Soviet Union, and parts of France, the Nazis would have enforced harsh policies aimed at the systematic displacement and extermination of non-Aryan populations, including Jews, Slavs, and Roma. Local collaborators and political leaders might have been given nominal authority, but their actions would have been strictly dictated by German interests, particularly in resource-rich regions like Ukraine and the Balkans. Italy under Mussolini would have ruled over its North African and Mediterranean territories with a similar structure, though Italy's power would have been secondary to Germany's. Mussolini's regime would have sought to implement its vision of fascist governance, maintaining control through military presence and propaganda. The Italian Empire would have been governed by Italian officials, but would have been heavily influenced by German directives, particularly in terms of economic exploitation and military cooperation. Japan, as a junior partner in the Axis, would have established its own sphere of influence in Asia. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere would have been governed through military occupation, with Japan as the dominant force. Local rulers might have been allowed to remain in power, but they would have been subjugated to Japan's will, particularly in places like China and Southeast Asia. Japan's governance structure would have been built around the exploitation of resources, with a strong emphasis on military control to suppress any resistance movements. In this hierarchical system, social and cultural policies would have been strictly controlled. In Nazi-controlled regions, racial purity laws would have been implemented with brutal force, and the idea of Aryan supremacy would have shaped every aspect of life. In occupied territories, cultural identities would have been suppressed, with the goal of homogenizing societies to fit Nazi ideology. Propaganda would have been pervasive, with education and media serving to reinforce Axis ideologies of totalitarianism and militarism. In conclusion, Axis rule would have been an iron-fisted hierarchical system built on military control, political subjugation, and racial ideologies. The world under Axis rule would have been a brutal, oppressive regime where autonomy and diversity were eliminated in favor of a single authoritarian order dominated by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The fate of the United States and Commonwealth nations. In an alternate history where the Axis powers achieved victory in World War II, the fate of the United States and Commonwealth nations would have been shaped by military defeat, political realignment, and the imposition of harsh authoritarian regimes. The global dominance of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan would have left little room for the survival of democratic values and national sovereignty as we know them. The United States, having been one of the leading powers opposing the Axis, would have faced severe consequences if the Axis had won. With the fall of Britain, the U.S. would have been left isolated, vulnerable to Axis military power, and potentially divided between occupation, resistance, and negotiation. A prolonged war in the Americas might have unfolded, with the U.S. either succumbing to direct invasion by Axis forces or being forced into a negotiated peace that left it politically crippled. Nazi Germany would likely have sought to establish its hegemony over North America, particularly with the strategic objective of controlling the Western Hemisphere, including vital resources like oil and agriculture. The Axis would have seen the United States not only as a military target, but also as an ideological threat. With the defeat of the U.S., Germany would have likely imposed a puppet government in Washington, with American elites serving under Nazi influence. This government would have been modeled on fascist principles, suppressing any traces of democracy or freedom. In the event that the U.S. fell under full Axis occupation, the country would have experienced the same brutal repression seen in Europe, with widespread purges, forced labor, and the suppression of resistance movements. For the Commonwealth nations, the fate would have been similarly grim. Britain, the heart of the Commonwealth, would have either capitulated to Nazi forces through a negotiated surrender or faced a brutal invasion following the failure of Operation Sea Lion. If Britain had been occupied, the British Empire would have likely fractured, with former colonies either coming under Axis control or declaring independence under Axis puppetry. Countries like Canada, Australia, and India would have faced harsh repercussions. The vast resources of the Commonwealth would have been exploited to fuel the Axis war machine and the Nazi regime, while the populations of these nations would be subjected to varying degrees of authoritarian control and exploitation. In this world, the United States and Commonwealth nations would have been reduced to subjugated states under Axis dominance, their political systems crushed, and their sovereignty erased. The future of these nations would have been one of collaboration, resistance, or outright tyranny, with Axis powers firmly asserting control over the globe. The democratic ideals once championed by these nations would have been all but extinguished, replaced by a totalitarian order determined to reshape the world in its own image. Rivalries and divisions among Axis powers. Despite their alliance during World War II, the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, were far from a unified bloc. Their shared goal of territorial expansion and domination was clouded by underlying rivalries and divisions, many of which would have continued to affect their relations even in a world where they emerged victorious. These tensions would have shaped the structure of global governance and the future of Axis rule, creating potential fractures within the Axis system. One of the primary sources of division was the relationship between Nazi Germany and Italy. Mussolini's ambitions to establish a Roman Empire in the Mediterranean often clashed with Hitler's more expansive goals in Europe and beyond. Italy's limited military success and its dependence on Germany for resources and support caused frustration within the fascist leadership. While Hitler saw Italy as a junior partner, Mussolini sought greater autonomy and influence. The German occupation of Italy after Mussolini's downfall during the war only highlighted the weaknesses of Italy's position within the Axis. Japan, while a vital partner in the Axis, had its own ambitions in the Pacific and Asia that some conflicted with Germany's European-centered expansionist goals. Japan's imperialist ambitions in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific were driven by a desire to secure natural resources and establish a dominant position in Asia. However, Japan's goals often ran counter to those of Germany, which was primarily focused on European and Soviet territories. The lack of coordination between Japan and Germany was evident in strategic decision-making, as both powers frequently acted independently in their respective theaters of war. The divisions between the Axis powers were also evident in their approaches to governance and ideology. While Nazi Germany pursued a racially motivated agenda of Aryan supremacy and the extermination of undesired populations, Italy and Japan, though similarly authoritarian, did not fully embrace the same extreme racial policies. Mussolini's fascism was more rooted in nationalism and imperialism, while Japan's ideology was centered around the divine status of the emperor and the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. These differences in ideological foundations led to occasional friction in their cooperation, particularly in terms of how conquered peoples and territories were treated. Even if the Axis had won the war, these rivalries and divisions would have likely continued to undermine their unity. The balance of power between Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan would have been fragile, with each nation striving to maintain or expand its influence in the post-war world. This internal strife could have led to competing ambitions, potential conflicts over territory and resources, and ultimately the collapse of the Axis order in the long term. The absence of a cohesive Axis strategy would have left room for dissent and resistance, even from within the powers that had once been united in their pursuit of domination. Chapter 10: The Cold War That Could Have Been. In a world where the Axis powers secured victory in World War II, the geopolitical landscape would have been dramatically different, giving rise to a new kind of Cold War. Without the traditional Allied powers to oppose them, the Axis, now in control of much of Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, would have faced internal tensions and competing ambitions that could have mirrored the ideological confrontations of the post-war Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. One of the most notable aspects of this alternative Cold War would have been the rivalry between the Axis powers themselves. Nazi Germany, as the dominant power in Europe, would have sought to maintain its hegemony, while Japan, with its imperial ambitions in Asia and the Pacific, might have viewed the German influence in Europe and the Middle East as a threat to its own expansionist goals. This tension would have created an intense competition for global supremacy, each power trying to assert its dominance over the other, with the Middle East, Africa, and Asia as the primary battlegrounds. The ideological differences among the Axis powers would have exacerbated these tensions. Nazi Germany, driven by a racial ideology that sought the extermination or subjugation of entire peoples, was likely to adopt a policy of racial purity across the territories it controlled. This would have placed it in conflict with Japan, whose imperial project focused on creating a Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, where the Japanese emperor was seen as a divine leader, but with a focus on cooperation rather than racial domination. These conflicting ideologies could have led to disputes over the treatment of occupied peoples, as well as the future governance of Asia and Africa. At the same time, former Allied powers such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union would have likely formed resistance movements, either from exile or clandestinely, within the occupied territories. This underground opposition could have been a significant source of tension within the Axis-controlled world. The U.S., despite its defeat, would have likely maintained a large degree of influence in the Americas and possibly parts of Asia, creating a rivalry with Japan and Germany over control of strategic regions. In this alternative Cold War, Diplomacy, espionage, and proxy wars would have been key components. The struggle for global dominance would have been waged not through direct military conflict, but through the manipulation of weaker nations, resource control, and ideological influence. The New World Order, dominated by Axis powers, would have been defined by a tense standoff between its leading powers, as they each sought to solidify their hold over the territories they had conquered while avoiding direct confrontation with one another. This Cold War could have lasted for decades, with the balance of power constantly shifting, but the underlying competition for ultimate control of the globe never fading. Would Germany and Japan have remained allies? In an Axis victory scenario, the relationship between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan would have been strained and fraught with challenges. While both nations shared a common enemy during World War II, their long-term alliance was based more on convenience and mutual benefit rather than a deep ideological or strategic alignment. The question of whether they would have remained allies in the post-war world hinges on several factors, including their conflicting ambitions, divergent ideologies, and the realities of global domination. Germany and Japan had fundamentally different goals. Nazi Germany sought to dominate Europe and the Soviet Union, driven by its quest for Lebensraum and the expansion of its Aryan-based empire. Meanwhile, Japan's imperial ambitions were focused on establishing control over Asia and the Pacific, primarily to secure resources and create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This divergence in territorial goals could have led to tensions, particularly as both powers sought to expand their influence in areas like the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa, where their interests might have overlapped. Ideologically, the Axis powers were not as united as their wartime alliance suggested. Germany's racial policies, rooted in Aryan supremacy, sought the extermination or subjugation of non-Germanic peoples, which sharply contrasted with Japan's emphasis on the divine status of the emperor and the notion of racial purity within Asia. While both nations practiced authoritarian rule, their core beliefs were not fully aligned. Japan's more conservative, nationalist ideology, centered on the emperor and Shintoism, did not always align with Germany's extreme racial nationalism. And this ideological gap would likely have been a point of friction in a post-war world. Moreover, the dynamics of a victorious Axis would have introduced additional pressures on the alliance. Both Germany and Japan had plans for territorial expansion that would have created inevitable competition for resources and strategic control. The vast territories that each would have controlled could have placed them in direct opposition to one another, with both vying for supremacy in regions like the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. Finally, the presence of former Allied powers would have influenced the future of the Germany-Japan alliance. The United States, in particular, would have remained a significant rival, potentially fostering competition between the Axis powers as they sought to assert their dominance over the Americas and other strategic regions. As Germany and Japan consolidated their power, the survival of their alliance would have depended on their ability to manage these growing rivalries and their shared desire to resist any external threats, especially from the Soviet Union or the remnants of Western powers. In the end, while it's possible that Germany and Japan could have remained allies in the early years of a post-war world, their differing objectives and ideologies might have eventually led to a breakdown in their partnership, giving rise to new tensions and potentially a Cold War between the two powers. The potential rise of a new superpower. In a world where the Axis powers emerged victorious in World War II, the global balance of power would have shifted dramatically, creating the potential for the rise of a new superpower. While Germany and Japan would have been the primary players in the Axis-controlled world, a host of other nations could have played significant roles in the development of this new power dynamic. Depending on how the Axis powers chose to govern and maintain control over their vast territories, it is possible that a new superpower could have arisen from the ashes of former Allied states, regional powers, or even a revived Soviet Union. The United States, despite its defeat in the war, would have likely retained its industrial base and technological prowess, allowing it to recover and become a potential rival to the Axis powers. With a vast landmass and an abundance of resources, the U.S. would have had the capability to reassert its dominance in the Western Hemisphere, possibly uniting the Americas under its influence. The emergence of the U.S. as a global superpower could have been fueled by its ability to build alliances with nations that were not fully under Axis control, using diplomacy, covert operations, or economic influence to counterbalance Axis rule. Another potential source of a new superpower could have been the Soviet Union. Although the USSR was devastated by the Axis invasion, a surviving and revitalized Soviet state could have posed a significant challenge to the Axis powers. The Soviets' military resilience, industrial capabilities, and strategic geographical positioning could have enabled them to rebuild and eventually challenge the Axis for global supremacy. A resurgent Soviet Union might have gained support from anti-Axis factions and resistance movements within Europe and Asia, leading to the creation of a Cold War-style standoff between the Axis and the Soviets, even without the traditional U.S.-Soviet rivalry. In addition to these possibilities, former colonial powers like the United Kingdom, France, and others in the British Commonwealth might have tried to consolidate their remaining influence, forming alliances with independent nations or staging uprisings within Axis-controlled territories. The collective efforts of these powers, along with emerging nationalist movements in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, could have created a new bloc of nations with the ambition and resources to challenge the Axis powers. The potential rise of a new superpower would have reshaped the global political landscape in profound ways, creating tensions, alliances, and rivalries in a world dominated by Axis rule. Whether through economic, military, or ideological means, the fight for global supremacy would have continued long after the Axis victory, setting the stage for an unpredictable and volatile future. The impact on global politics and technology. In a world where the Axis powers won World War II, the impact on global politics and technology would have been profound and far-reaching, reshaping the course of history. The political landscape would have been dominated by totalitarian regimes that exerted control over vast territories, while technological advancements would have taken on a new direction, driven by the ambitions of the Axis powers. The combination of political shifts and technological innovations would have created a drastically different global order, with new centers of power, influence, and technological progress emerging in ways unimaginable before the war. Politically, the Axis victory would have likely resulted in a divided world order, with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan as the dominant powers. Germany, with its vision of a racially pure European empire, would have imposed a totalitarian system across much of Europe, including the Soviet Union, with a firm grip on the continent. Japan, with its ambitions in Asia and the Pacific, would have sought to establish a similar authoritarian order in the East. The resulting geopolitical landscape would have left little room for democracy, as fascist and militaristic regimes proliferated. The global political environment would have seen the United States, once the leader of the Western world, relegated to a secondary role. Without its position as a superpower, the U.S. would have been forced to navigate a tense and unstable international system, perhaps focused on securing its own territorial and economic interests within the Americas. Meanwhile, countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, which were often seen as pawns in the broader power struggle, would have experienced shifts in power dynamics as their fates were shaped by Axis policies of colonial domination or exploitation. In terms of technology, the Axis powers would have leveraged their advancements in military and industrial technologies to solidify their dominance. Germany's pursuit of rocket technology, jet engines, and early nuclear research would have continued, potentially leading to the rapid development of new forms of weaponry and warfare. The fusion of German expertise in scientific research and Japan's technological capabilities in engineering would have made for a powerful combination, possibly accelerating progress in areas like computing, communications, and military technologies. The world would have seen technological developments used primarily for military and control purposes, as both Axis powers sought to maintain dominance through technological superiority. On the global stage, the Axis powers' victory would have left a lasting legacy of authoritarian regimes, surveillance states, and technological arms races. With limited checks and balances on technological advancements, this new world order might have seen rapid, but often oppressive, innovations. The drive for efficiency, control, and military might would have guided technological progress, with little regard for humanitarian concerns or ethical implications. The focus on technology as a tool of power and control would have shaped the future of both politics and technological innovation, creating a world defined by domination, surveillance, and potentially unchecked scientific advancement. Chapter 11: The Legacy of an Axis Victory. The legacy of an Axis victory in World War II would have left an indelible mark on the course of history, shaping the political, social, and cultural fabric of the 20th century and beyond. The aftermath of such a victory would have meant the establishment of totalitarian regimes across much of the world, with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan leading the charge in their quest for global dominance. This alternate reality would have fundamentally altered the direction of civilization, leaving behind a legacy of oppression, control, and division. The most immediate impact would have been the expansion and entrenchment of fascist ideologies. Under Nazi leadership, the concept of racial purity would have driven policies that sought to reshape the population of Europe and beyond. The systematic oppression of ethnic minorities, particularly Jews, Slavs, and Romani people, would have been an enduring legacy of the Third Reich, creating a Europe marked by widespread human rights violations and the elimination of entire cultures. The brutal policies of racial and political extermination would have been perpetuated on an even larger scale, and resistance movements within occupied territories would have faced extreme repression. In Asia, Japan's imperial ambitions would have transformed the Pacific and Southeast Asia into a series of puppet states under its control. The ideology of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere would have been enforced with authoritarian measures, aiming to spread Japanese influence across the continent. The legacy of this would have been the subjugation of millions of people, with little room for political freedoms or self-determination. The idea of a hierarchical, racially defined world order would have persisted, with Japan at the top and subjugated peoples beneath them. On the global stage, the United States would have been left to navigate a world dominated by Axis powers. The U.S. might have resorted to isolationism, withdrawing from global affairs and focusing on securing its own interests in the Americas. Meanwhile, former colonial powers would have been dismantled, and new geopolitical rivalries would have emerged, with nations seeking to align themselves with or resist the dominance of the Axis. A Cold War-like scenario could have arisen, particularly between the Axis powers themselves, as Germany and Japan contended for control over resources and influence. Technologically, the Axis victory would have ushered in an era of scientific advancements driven by military and control needs. Weapons of mass destruction, surveillance technologies, and efficient methods of governance would have been at the forefront of this new world order. However, with these advancements came the dark side of technological progress, as innovations would have been geared toward maintaining authoritarian control over populations, rather than advancing human welfare or peace. Ultimately, the legacy of an Axis victory would have been one of dominance, division, and oppression, shaping a world where freedom and democracy were distant dreams rather than achievable realities. The scars of this alternate history would have persisted for generations, creating a global order marked by fear, resistance, and an unrelenting struggle for autonomy. Culture, science, and ideology under Axis rule. Under Axis rule, culture, science, and ideology would have been deeply intertwined, with the state wielding significant control over the intellectual, artistic, and scientific spheres to enforce their totalitarian visions. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, each with their own distinct ideologies, would have shaped a world in which the freedoms that foster individual creativity, scientific advancement, and cultural diversity were severely restricted, leaving behind a legacy of state-sanctioned culture and research. In Nazi Germany, the state's oppressive ideology would have been the primary influence over culture and science. The Nazi regime's belief in racial purity and Aryan superiority would have permeated all aspects of life, dictating what was considered acceptable art, literature, and philosophy. The regime would have sought to eliminate any cultural expressions that were seen as degenerate, including modernist art movements, Jewish and socialist works, and any other forms of expression that did not align with the Nazi worldview. Instead, culture would have been geared toward promoting nationalistic pride, military valor, and the supremacy of the Aryan race. Art, music, and literature would have been used as propaganda tools, glorifying the ideals of the regime and serving as instruments for indoctrination. Similarly, science under Axis rule would have been redirected to support ideological goals. In Germany, scientists would have been expected to produce research that validated Nazi racial theories and supported the development of weapons for military conquest. The focus of scientific inquiry would have shifted away from unbiased exploration and toward the creation of technology that reinforced the regime's power. Medical experimentation on marginalized groups, such as Jews, disabled individuals, and prisoners, would have expanded in the pursuit of pseudoscientific racial policies. The promise of advancing humanity through science would have been replaced by dangerous ideologies that justified horrific actions. In Japan, the emphasis would have been on militarism and imperialism. Japanese culture, deeply rooted in the values of honor, loyalty, and obedience, would have been further entrenched, promoting the idea of Japan's divine mission to lead Asia and the Pacific. The arts and sciences would have supported these ideals, with Japan's technological advancements aimed at enhancing military capabilities and securing dominance over its neighbors. Cultural expressions would have been carefully controlled to maintain a sense of unity and conformity, while science would be focused on technological superiority, particularly in fields like aviation, naval warfare, and biological warfare. Both Axis powers would have stifled intellectual freedom, repressing dissent and curbing independent thought. The pursuit of knowledge would have been subordinated to the goals of the state, limiting progress in areas that did not align with the totalitarian objectives of the regimes. The resulting cultural and scientific landscape would have been one of oppression, conformity, and the relentless pursuit of dominance, leaving little room for innovation or the advancement of human welfare. In this alternate world, culture and science would have been tools of control rather than instruments of enlightenment and progress. The future of democracy and human rights. In a world where the Axis powers have emerged victorious in World War II, the future of democracy and human rights would be dramatically altered. With the dominance of totalitarian regimes, particularly Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the principles of democracy would have been crushed, and human rights would be suppressed on an unprecedented scale. Democracy, as we understand it today, would likely have become an obsolete concept under Axis rule. In Nazi Germany, the authoritarian state would have expanded its grip over occupied Europe, eliminating democratic institutions and replacing them with puppet regimes loyal to Berlin. Free elections, freedom of speech, and the protection of minority rights would have been seen as subversive and counterproductive to the Nazi vision of order and racial purity. Governments would have been centralized, with power firmly in the hands of a select few, such as Hitler's inner circle or other Nazi leaders. The citizens of these territories would have been subjected to oppressive surveillance, forced conformity, and harsh punishment for any signs of dissent. In occupied countries, the concept of self-determination and national sovereignty would have been eradicated. Nations would be forced to comply with the whims of their conquerors, and the people would be systematically deprived of their civil liberties. Laws would be designed to protect the state, not the individual. The rights to assemble, express dissent, or even maintain cultural traditions would have been stifled, with the regime's ideologies dictating every aspect of life. Human rights would have been systematically undermined under Axis rule. In Nazi-controlled territories, the persecution of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and political dissidents would have escalated, with the state's racist policies resulting in mass extermination campaigns. The regime's view of undesirable populations would have expanded to include any groups perceived as a threat to the Aryan vision. Japan's imperialist ambitions would similarly result in the subjugation and exploitation of entire populations across Asia, where forced labor, cultural destruction, and brutal occupation would be the norm. On the global stage, human rights organizations like the United Nations would likely have never existed. The Axis powers would have sought to impose their own hierarchical, racially motivated system on the world, leaving no room for the ideals of equality, liberty, and justice that democracy cherishes. Resistance movements, though valiant, would face fierce opposition, and any hope of creating a free and democratic world would seem increasingly distant. In this dark alternate future, the very notion of human dignity and the rule of law would have been eroded, as the world would have been dominated by regimes that saw individual rights as expendable in pursuit of totalitarian control and imperial dominance. The long-term consequences for the modern world, a world where the Axis powers won World War II, would have profound and lasting consequences for the modern world, reshaping international relations, technological advancements, and societal structures in ways unimaginable to those living in the early 20th century. The ramifications of such a victory would reverberate through decades, if not centuries, of global history. First and foremost, the global political landscape would have been forever altered. With Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in control of large portions of Europe and Asia, the dominance of Western democratic powers, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, would have been nullified. The ideals of democracy and self-determination would have been obliterated, replaced by a harsh, authoritarian world order where the Axis powers would govern through puppet regimes, forcing their ideologies upon conquered nations. The balance of power in the 20th century would have shifted entirely, with the Axis forming a monopolistic global alliance, sidelining any hope of resistance or rebellion for decades. The long-term impact on global trade and economics would also have been catastrophic for non-Axis nations. The Axis powers would have sought to control the world's most valuable resources, including oil, rare minerals, and agricultural commodities, making them nearly impossible for other countries to access. A global economy centered on Axis-controlled regions would have stifled competition, leading to monopolies and the rise of corporate giants aligned with the Axis regimes. This economic monopoly would have extended to technology as well, with Axis nations dominating scientific advancements and suppressing or co-opting any innovations that didn't fit their vision. Technological progress, though potentially advanced under Axis rule, would have been driven by military needs and the pursuit of total dominance. The civilian population would have seen fewer benefits from advancements in science and technology, as innovations would be used primarily to enforce control, suppress resistance, and enhance warfare. A world that could have seen rapid technological growth and cooperation under democratic systems would have been stifled by the competitive, secretive nature of totalitarian regimes. Culturally, the modern world would be a much darker place. Diversity, freedom of expression, and cultural exchange would be suppressed under the Axis vision of racial purity and imperial dominance. Artistic freedom would be replaced by state-approved propaganda, and intellectual thought would be heavily censored. The modern world, with its emphasis on multiculturalism, tolerance, and individual rights, would have never materialized. In the long run, the world would be a place marked by oppression, limited progress, and the stifling of basic human freedoms. The modern ideals of democracy, human rights, and international cooperation would be nothing more than distant, forgotten dreams, as humanity would have lived under the shadow of the Axis powers for generations. Conclusion. The hypothetical scenario of an Axis victory in World War II presents a chilling and thought-provoking vision of the modern world. It forces us to reflect on the fragile nature of international power dynamics and how the rise of totalitarian regimes could reshape civilization. The Axis powers' success would have led to a fundamentally different global order, one defined by oppression, authoritarianism, and the suppression of individual freedoms. Had the Axis been victorious, the political landscape would have been dominated by a few authoritarian regimes, each with a distinct vision of empire building and racial supremacy. The defeat of democratic nations such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and France would have wiped out any remaining hopes for the global spread of democratic ideals. A world led by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan would have crushed freedom of thought, speech, and culture, replacing them with rigid state-controlled ideologies. Economically, the Axis powers would have sought to monopolize global resources, turning the world into a collection of vassal states subject to their control. Such monopolies would have stifled competition, hampering innovation and global cooperation. Technology and science, while possibly advancing under Axis regimes, would have served primarily military and imperial purposes, leaving the broader population with little to gain from progress. Culturally, the Axis victory would have heralded an era of intellectual censorship and cultural homogeneity. The world would have seen a dramatic reduction in the exchange of ideas and artistic expression, with totalitarian propaganda dominating public discourse. Under these regimes, diversity and multiculturalism would have been eradicated in favor of a world driven by racial purity and military might. Ultimately, the Axis victory would have been a dark chapter in human history, one where the most basic human rights were stripped away and the potential for a more equitable, collaborative, and progressive world was lost. The ideas of freedom, democracy, and international cooperation would have remained distant, ever elusive ideals, with the modern world trapped under the control of oppressive regimes. In this alternate history, humanity would have found itself on a path of stagnation, where survival was more important than progress, and where the values we hold most dear today would have never come to fruition.